Okay, I think we're live. So tonight I'm joined with Quentin Lee, and we're going to be discussing a few topics here. I thought for this discussion, our general thesis or theme would be what we can say about God, but I suspect it'll drift onto some other topics too, probably concerning epistemology, the limits of logic, and probably a few other related topics. So maybe to start, perhaps you could introduce yourself, maybe just summarize your intellectual positions.
I guess I don't have any credentials behind my name. I was pretty much invited because Mathema by proxy said, I guess atheists are cowards and won't talk to him. And I thought, well, I'm not a coward, so I'll talk.
Well, if I said that, I have to retract that immediately if I called you a coward. So I will confess that I was complaining a little bit how it seems that nowadays the discussion online concerning what I consider to be very important questions, like on foundational issues, just seems to be a little bit insipid. I was kind of disappointed how a lot of the big atheist channels and also a lot of big theist channels say they don't really seem to have a desire to actually discuss these issues with one another. What seems to be going on is just these pot shots. Someone makes a video, then someone salami slices the video and criticizes it point by point. And you never really have a good give and take. So I guess that's what I was complaining about. But continue.
Yeah, I do. I agree. I think it's very tribal in nature. I think it's kind of like a pseudo meme culture where you have people just saying what they believe the other side is saying and not truly go after their arguments. And I guess ultimately it depends, because I wouldn't agree that there's just kind of one group of atheists or one group of theists. There's many different groups online and they have many different characteristics as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know this is one big conversation, even like an in-house debate among atheists, it seems. Because I was an atheist for many years too, and certainly there are many factions within the atheists. I mean, many seem to be influenced by the, but I guess what theists would often call the new atheism, which is, people in the ilk of, say, Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. And then there seem to be a few others too. As for myself, I was more of the Nietzschean sort, like the philosophical atheist. But yeah, like you said, there are many different factions within the atheists, and certainly within theists too. I mean, within the theists, I would consider myself as it's what's called a classical theist, like as a student of the classical tradition of theology, going back to I would actually push it back to Plato, Aristotle, through Saint Augustine, and also Saint Thomas Aquinas. So you're right. Yeah, there's certainly a diversity of intellectual positions on both sides.
Yeah, I do know Friended Forever, which I think is where we met in the chat. He did, I think, a reasonable video on, I guess, different varying groups of kind of how the new atheist movement kind of split up around 2012. Mm-hmm. It's basically people arrived to their atheism through different means. Like some people thought it perceived as care or harm, like their like LGBT issues. They didn't view it as good, so they left. And some people viewed it kind of as like a science as some authority. So, and because I guess since they respected science, and some, I would say, especially in the South with at least creationism, that they didn't respect these forms of science as well, so they left it. And I would say there's probably the autist, which people just are pure and purist and say, you got to show me the evidence and nothing else. But I'm usually a little skeptical of those because everyone likes to say that, the evidence is on their side. So,
yeah, I mean that's one of the big questions, right? Is, well, first of all, we would have to talk about what evidence as such is, not just a certain class of evidence, because that seems to be one major issue that no one seems to talk about what evidence is as such. And what its intention is. It's just kind of thrown around, and people just say that the other side has no evidence whatsoever for their position.
I mean, yeah, I agree. And I guess to kind of tie it all together a little bit, I guess, because I know you're a big proponent of one area of the cosmological constant, I think the ordeal that you have basically a bunch of there's causes for I guess, can you word it better? I'm probably gonna mess it up. I'm not the best in philosophy or
Oh, that's fine. You mentioned the cosmological constant.
Oh, not the cosmological constant. I guess the crap. I just forgot what it's called. The cosmological.
Oh, you mean the argument?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that's one. That was the topic of my last video. So like I was saying before we got started, I would just say that the cosmological argument, it's called the cosmological argument, but it should really be thought of as a class of argument, like a form of reasoning, not just one particular argument. Because nowadays, when people say the cosmological argument, they immediately think of William Lane Craig and the what's called the Kalam cosmological argument, which tries to establish that the universe had a beginning in time, and because the universe came into existence, it requires a cause which brought it into existence. So that's only one sort of cosmological argument. So I would say that the general form of the reasoning of the cosmological argument is trying to take general features of our everyday experience, such as things being composite, that is, that they have parts, or as the Kalam suggests, coming into existence, or there being a separation between what's called the essence and the existence, the essence being what the thing is, and the existence obviously being that it is. That these things, these specific sort of things, because they have that feature, they require a prior cause. And the reason goes that this chain of causation being of a certain type itself, which I mean, we would say a hierarchical or order per se, needs a first member. So I would characterize the cosmological arguments as exemplifying that sort of reasoning as opposed to one particular sort of cosmological argument, as opposed to, like the Kalam being one example. So is that what you were
yeah, I was trying to
asking about?
Get down, because for sometimes what I've seen the argument a little bit online, it's sometimes it just completely refers to like the physical, like certain properties of movement. And I was wondering, I guess I'm not too informed about the metaphysical, so I might mess this up, but does this apply to, I guess, laws of logic as well? Do those have to have causes in order for them to be correct as well?
Well, I mean, that seems to bring up another side issue as to what a law of logic is. I mean, is it like a Platonic form, or I mean, in what way does it exist? I guess I would ask.
I guess I'm not too familiar. I guess, what do you mean by Platonic?
Oh, I mean, it's like abstracted from the particulars, and it kind of exists in a third realm.
Yeah, I guess
third realm. I mean, they're like the two realms. There's like the world, the visible world, and then we have the mind. And then for Plato, there's like a third realm, the realm of forms. So like the forms would be, for example, those would be things like the good, or the beautiful, or to take another example, triangularity. Like there is a form of the triangle. I mean, the whole rationale behind this is that we see particular instances of triangles, and we seem to be able to extract some commonality out of those particulars.
Yeah,
and Plato posited that particular in a third realm. So I guess with your question of whether laws of logic would need causes too, I mean, to answer that question, we would have to talk about what a law of logic is. But there is a related issue, though, that's important with these sorts of arguments that a classical theist especially would make, is that on the opposite side, there are often very glib appeals to laws of physics or laws of nature. But to kind of that raises a side issue of what these laws of nature even are.
I guess ultimately,
right?
Because with the laws of nature, it's, or I guess how I view science currently, and I guess probably Gary Edwards would be a better person to ask, because he focuses a lot more on the philosophy of science. It's ultimately, I view science as a kind of an ever-correcting model through empirical observation. It's, you never, like, there is an objective reality, and you build these systems of observation of, like, laws just describe how things are, and theorems will describe why things are. And ultimately, you just, I guess, over time, correct these to become ever more increasingly accurate, I guess, depending on the scenario.
Mhm.
And I do think what's important, which a lot of people really don't realize, is that many scientific models have bounds, is that they can't overextend to everything and predict everything really far. Like Newtonian mechanics works pretty well until you start going near the speed of light, or you start getting pretty close to strong gravitational fields, and you can start using general relativity. Because in certain scenarios, these models work very well, but then you understand, and because they have to make these assumptions, like for Newtonian mechanics, you have to assume that space and time are static and they're always constant. But then you start through basically different testing, you can find out that these can change in various scenarios, and then they start becoming important for the model later on. So I would say for at least science is you have to at least observe to test these logical axioms to see if they're true or not. It's basically you can come up with logical axioms, but at the end of the day, you have to ultimately test them to see their validity or not, or how accurate they are in predicting the real world.
Oh, sure. Yeah, like you brought up one of the classic examples of Newtonian mechanics and how it seems to have a limited domain of applicability, and it breaks down in certain phenomena. If I remember the history correctly, one of the major phenomena that Newtonian mechanics had a problem with was the precession of the perihelion of Mercury.
Yeah, that's one of the
orbit of Mercury, right?
And it's that,
kind of
and
one of the examples.
And explain why light bent in gravitational fields, because it doesn't have mass, so it didn't make any sense.
Oh yeah, the gravitational lensing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think you're right about that. That these laws of physics or laws of nature that we identify, they seem to have a limited realm of applicability. I think you were saying before too that the way you describe them as to what they are is that they're descriptions of regularities that we see.
Yeah, is most of the time, and I think people are willing to admit this, is for most theories that you observe or test or want to basically test and try to falsify, is you ultimately test these laws of logic to see if they're correct or not. And like I guess the laws of logic, like I guess you could say there's a certain set out there. We don't know what they are, but we're trying to model them through science. And it probably won't ever get to that point where we can 100% accurately depict everything going on in the universe, but it's trying to mimic that model as closely as possible through observation.
Right. Yeah. So science seems to proceed in this manner where you posit some sort of regularity, like a law, and then you try to test it and find where its defects are going to be. Try to falsify it.
Yeah, the law
try to update the model, right?
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I might be wrong because I'm not really a scientist either. But a law is just an observation of something going on, like Newton's 3 laws. Those are just observations. It doesn't explain why they're there. It just explains what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then a theorem or a theory would basically be a compilation of laws to essentially explain the different laws. Like general relativity would be a theory to explain gravitational forces, or I guess you wouldn't really say forces ultimately, but it explains how gravity works, would be kind of the theory. It would be why. But you can always keep going and say why for this, and ultimately you're gonna end up reaching a point that it just is that. And I guess that's one of the things I was gonna ask about the cosmological argument. Like, if something has the property of magnetism, ultimately you just have to say it has the property of magnetism because it just does, because it's an electron or it's a proton. Would you say there's something inert within it that causes that, or would you say there's something outside to cause that in order for that to happen?
Well, I guess we'd have to talk about when you attribute magnetism to that thing. What was your example? It was an electron.
Yeah, because ultimately you have an electron, and you're saying it
Yeah.
has these properties. Or I guess to also make it different would be like a certain property of like inertia.
Oh, so maybe just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So those things, those properties, which we seem to attribute to actual things like, let's say, like the magnetic moment or spin of an electron. I guess you're asking, are those just necessary things which come from those things? We just have to accept that.
Well, I guess because the cosmological argument sounds like it's mostly dealing with movement. I
Mhm.
guess I was trying to also ask if it would also it would also have to require if you if you have these inherent properties like magnetism or inertia or whatever,
Mhm.
if there's something that has to enact upon it in order for it to receive these properties, or at some point in time that these had to be enacted onto the system in order for these properties to propagate.
Well, it depends on what you're asking. What would require a cause in those things? I think certain properties flow from what a thing is, meaning that they're entailed from what a thing is. Like I think electrons have certain properties which have a sort of necessity to them. Just like if you take a larger example, just like human beings, I think there are certain things, there are certain properties that we have which just flow from the way we are by our very nature. So I think those have a sort of necessity to them. But I think what requires a cause, what we would have to go back to those things that we're picking out within our experience that we say require a cause. For example, that which is in motion requires a cause, or that whose essence is different from its existence requires a cause. So I'm not sure that I think for there to be natures at all, for there to be things that could have conceivably not existed, I think that those sorts of things require a cause for their existence. I'm not sure if that answered what you were asking there.
I guess a little bit because of the cosmological argument mostly deals with movement. Because
Mhm.
also I saw one of
I
the
guess one yeah, I guess one formulation you could say deals with motion. Even though there, I should emphasize that unless you've seen that video in question, the part one of the defensive classical theology series, motion there is not understood
not
in
the
the.
necessity. That's why I was asking about I guess more abstract and I guess inherent properties as well.
Mhm. Yes, I guess you're asking necessity in the sense of there being certain properties which come from particular things.
Yeah, but I guess empirically it would become it's either we would never know or we could never test because ultimately we kind of reach the wall of saying these characteristics are just these characteristics within observation. Like we don't know what causes them or why they have
Mhm.
them, they just do.
Yeah, that could be. I guess that could be taken in a few different ways. So I do agree with. I suspect you have an intuition that things at the end of the day, in our last analysis, it has to come down to something necessary, which has to be the way it is in and of itself, as opposed to being conceivably being something different.
I'd say
Is that
currently that's where I stand because I don't see evidence of, I guess, properties within substances having an infinite regression.
yeah? I guess I would agree with that. That properties within substances don't regress infinitely. Um, perhaps the question of necessity you were asking is the necessity of the properties coming from the particular things, or because there is a related concept of the relation between contingency and necessity, but that has more to do with the very existence of the thing, not just the particular property that comes from what the thing is, but just the sheer existence of the thing at all.
I guess I'm not I guess just to remind everyone in the chat, I'm not too well versed into philosophy.
No, me neither.
Look, I disagree. I had to look up a lot of stuff. I guess ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to ask a little bit is, I guess I don't want to say the cosmological argument, but I guess a form of the cosmological argument is, does there saying there has to be a cause for abstract concepts, or the abstract realm ultimately?
Oh, so yeah, that's an interesting topic, because I mean, there's a whole history behind this very question about in what way abstract things exist. I mean, they're like any issue in philosophy. There are a bunch of positions. There's like my position, which is called a realist. I mean, we're pretty we're pretty bold, and we just say, yeah, these abstract things, they exist. For example, triangularity exists. Redness as a universal exists, but there's also a few other positions too. Yeah, like, there are particular red things, but I think there's something over and above those particular red things, in virtue of which we recognize the particulars. And that's a universal.
I guess, would you say some mathematical axioms would exist there, like imaginary numbers or certain complex
I certainly,
numbers?
yeah. I certainly agree that those exist. I guess you could say within realism, well, first I would say that they exist, but then there are a number of in-house debates upon what kind of realist you are. Like, there's the old Platonic realism, which says that these things exist in a third realm as like a form. But there's also other forms of realism, like there's an Aristotelian realism, which would say that these universals, they only exist insofar as they're instantiated in actual things. So redness exists, but it only exists in particular red things as it's instantiated in those particular things. And then there's a few other positions too. The one I hold, it's called scholastic realism, and it says the universals can exist in one of two ways. They can exist as an idea in the intellect, in some intellect, or they can exist as they are instantiated in actual things. So I guess you can say within the realist school, we all kind of agree that these abstract objects and universals, that they have existence, that they are real things. And that's opposed to, say, a nominalist who would say that these abstract things, they don't really exist. And what we're saying with like redness and triangularity, those are just names for things. So that's one position on this debate. Then there's conceptualism, which is, if I remember correctly, that they exist only as ideas in an intellect. So I guess when we talk about this question of abstract objects, there are a variety of positions that we would have to consider.
I guess.
I guess I guess of those, I know this is pretty quick, but which of those would you say most accurately describes your position, like a realist or a nominalist or a conceptualist?
I'm not exactly sure, but I'll try to sum up my position. I think I'm more agnostic at the moment. I think there's ways to tell how our reality governs itself. But like, if you have things like imaginary numbers, there's no empirical way to really view that. But I do think, because it is still completely logical to come to these terms, is you can use these logical terms, even though it may not have any basis in reality, to still relate it to other mathematical systems that relate to reality. I forgot what it's called, but I thought there was like a certain study in math, is that you look at basically a bunch of different various scenarios and you describe them with a similar mathematical model, even though they're drastically different. I'm not sure what it's called, but I think it's the ultimate goal is you try to find relations between different systems and you view how the math works a little bit between them. So I guess ultimately I don't think this abstract realm is real, but I guess the logic that it takes to get there, or I guess it would be kind of in the mind ultimately. Like, these are rules of logic, kind of like a language, is used to explain and communicate, like what we're doing right now. I think logic is system to basically model different forms of reality. Like you can use language to explain Harry Potter, even though Harry Potter doesn't exist.
Mhm.
And you can use systems of logic to explain scenarios that would never happen. Like you could set up, I guess, physics equations of scenarios that will never happen, but you could model how they would happen, even though they're not happening ever.
Yeah, I guess I mean this is a whole conversation in and of itself. I guess I can share one intuition I had back when I was I guess I would say like a logical positivist. I mean, one philosopher I read a lot was W.V. Quine, and he had this really interesting argument, I think, which has nothing to do with theology. I mean, just he claimed that if you're like a total reductionist and you're trying to figure out what sorts of things exist in a world, he said that if you kind of weed out all of the things that you don't need to do science, to say like high level physics, and if you can't reduce away abstract things, no matter what they are, like numbers or sets or some sort of fundamental abstract entity, then because you cannot dispense with it, and this is called the indispensability argument, because you cannot dispense with it, you are justified in accepting those sorts of things into your ontology, or the set of things that you think exists. So I thought that was a really interesting argument, because I am kind of convinced of that when you do even physics, I don't think you can just reduce away these abstract concepts by like appealing to some sort of motions among matter or some sort of neurological correlate. Like I think you do have to assume that these things are real existence just to explain why physics works at all. I mean, why we're able to use this logical system, like things like abstract or like imaginary numbers, and even the very notion of like limits and derivatives, how we're able to employ these abstract concepts at all to great success, as opposed to just being like random nonsense. Because I mean, I'm sure that you and I would agree that physics kind of, I mean, it works in a non-fortuitous way.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess some people in the chat were freaking out that I was saying imaginary numbers don't exist, but I guess ultimately I would say you can't, I guess to clarify my position a bit, is you can't empirically test it to know its validity or not, or test the model of how accurate imaginary numbers would be applied in the real world. Like I do know there's like certain complex systems you could use for polar coordinates that where you don't have to use imaginary numbers, but it's still like a useful tool, I guess, ultimately, even though I guess there's no empirical way to test imaginary numbers.
Yep, I certainly would agree that there's no empirical way to see these things like imaginary numbers and things like that. But from that, the conclusion I would draw is that there are certain things that are real, distinct objects of our intellect, which are non-empirical. I mean, have you heard the expression that one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens?
No, very new to the philosophy stuff.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So that's just, I mean, it's just highlighting the point that from one conditional statement, like if A then B, that two people can draw different conclusions from that. Like you were just saying that now that because I cannot empirically test it, I should not believe that abstract. If I cannot believe that I can empirically test it, then I shouldn't believe that something exists. But I would just flip that around on you and just say that, well, here I have an example of something which is, it's a distinct object of my intellect, and I can't empirically test it. Therefore, there are some things which are non-empirical, and I have distinct knowledge about. Whereas you might say that from that, you might very well conclude that because I can't empirically test it, that it's, I mean, I can't really genuinely know things about it. Well, I guess it's kind of highlighting the point that, I mean, many people can draw different conclusions from a conditional statement, like if A then B.
I guess to clarify a little bit, I'm not a pure empiricist. I do think rationality, you have to have it in order to examine at least, like you got to at least have rationality to at least examine empirical systems at the very, very least. And I guess what I would say ultimately is like you can have these different systems of logic. Like you and I might make different logical axioms. And if these different logical axioms come to the same conclusion, then how are we supposed to resolve that issue? Then I guess to explain a little further, as the analogy goes, is you have a race of super intelligent goldfish, and you have people, and the goldfish live in a spherical glass bowl. And let's say all they're allowed to do is watch a ball be thrown. And then the people essentially come up with kinematics, and then let's say the goldfish come up with some crazy algorithm that make different assumptions of how logic works. But since they both are able to predict how the ball moves, and essentially I guess the analogy of how empiricism, it can only go as far as looking at the scenario, you don't know ultimately which is correct, the goldfish or the people, unless you're able to further study and see which logical axioms were more accurate or not, and what people were making.
Yeah, so I guess to characterize that, would you agree that like the term underdetermined, that the phenomena underdetermine the abstract formulation of what you're seeing? Like, because you're saying that you can see like the same phenomena, and many people can come to different abstract formulations of what's going on there.
Yeah, I guess, because I guess that would be a form of inductive reasoning. Is you could come, I guess, one of my things, I guess, with the cosmological argument, because it mostly depends on inductive, or not inductive, deductive reasoning. I had to go look up the terms. It's you can have different, like, you may assume this is a logical principle, and then someone else might assume a different logical principle that contradicts that other one. But if you have a bunch of systems of these logical, I guess, assumptions, you can still arrive at the same conclusion. And then how would you test it once you have the same conclusion? Like, I'm just giving an example. Like, let's say the cosmological argument ultimately does determine there must be a God. And then, just for sake of argument, let's say someone else also has a deductive system, but they have different logical axioms where they say, no, there does not need to be a God. Then I guess how would you ultimately test which one's true, or find out which one's true?
So you're saying the second person is making logical inferences in a totally different way than the first person?
Yes.
I mean, I guess you would have to justify why he's doing that. I mean, there are good reasons that we use certain modes of inferences. For example, modus ponens and modus tollens. We don't just start making stuff up. Like abstractly, if you had an argument formed like if A then B, and from that you just concluded C, like something just totally different. I mean, people would. I mean, I guess that would be analogous to the second person. I mean, you can't just do that. I mean, we have to have some standard of how we're going to do logical inferences.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, how would you test logical inferences?
Well,
Or
I mean,
make sure
it
they're
sounds like
true or
you're.
not.
Well, I guess there's a problem here because you're kind of undercutting logic itself in this procedure. I mean, aren't you?
Haven't thought about it enough, which is probably not the right thing to say, but
Yeah,
I
because
guess
I guess if I were on the opposing side here, like if you had some argument which reached a conclusion that you didn't agree with, but you saw that within the argument the inferences were working correctly, what I wouldn't do is deny that logic can be kind of adjusted at whim. What I would do is try to locate where the false premises.
Well, I'm not
within that
saying
argument.
logic is relative.
Yeah.
I'm trying to say is that you could, like, there is an objective logic system, but I guess in some scenarios you wouldn't really know. Like, if we lived 300 years ago, we would assume the space and time is static, and we would assume that to be true when making models, but we don't know.
That's true. I mean, certainly there are concepts of our physical concepts of space and time have changed over time, right? But I guess I would say the cosmological arguments aren't really, they're not trying to propose some sort of alternate scientific hypothesis of trying to explain some sort of physical phenomena. They're trying to do something much more general than that. So they're not competing with physics or general relativity or anything like that.
Well, I'm not saying that. I guess what I'm trying to say, I guess ultimately, if you have a system of logic that applies to the metaphysical, and if any of these, I guess, series of logic infects the empirical realm, then you can, I guess, by proxy, test some of these metaphysical logical claims.
I guess, but I wonder though, like when you do that test, aren't you presupposing some sort of way of reasoning, like moving from different propositions to the other, just in the very act of testing things? Like, because I do think there are certain things that we can't really deny coherently. Like, I don't think the law of identity can be denied coherently, or the law of non-contradiction can be denied coherently. I mean, there are some defenses of why they're very basic thoughts that you can't coherently deny. So I guess I'm not quite sold on this idea of conjuring up another logical system in the way you're suggesting.
Well, I guess what I mean a little bit is, so the logical system can be completely true. Like, but you can have basically kind of like with the physics scenario, you can set up things that don't exist, but it would still, I guess, be true in a sense. Like I could say, I'm going to set up a scenario where there's 5 dimensions in the universe, or spatial dimensions. And it would still be, I guess, logically true, but that wouldn't make it, I guess, a thing that affects our reality. So I guess,
I guess I'm not quite clear on what you're objecting to within logic. Is it that you're proposing that people can propose different modes of inferring statements from other statements that might be like non-standard?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it?
Let's take an actual example. Like, suppose you take the argument that classic, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. I guess, are you proposing that we shouldn't reason in that way? That perhaps instead of that, we should have something like premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. And the conclusion is the cat is on the mat.
No, I guess because ultimately, like, that's a form of inductive reasoning, right? Socrates is mortal because men are mortal, and Socrates is a man.
The premises in that argument might be known through some sort of induction, but the mode of reasoning within that argument is deductive. Meaning that
I guess there's just I think there's just a form of miscommunication. So I'm not disagreeing that there's like I do believe there's incorrect systems of logic. Like it would lead to scenarios that don't make any sense whatsoever.
Right. I mean, just think. I mean, think about how this would apply in like daily life and daily conversation. If people just like reasoned in the way that they thought was appropriate, and it wasn't using correct modes of inference. I mean, under any other scenario, we would never entertain the idea that we should just change up our logical inferences because we don't agree with certain conclusions, right?
Well, I would say if there's evidence to bring, like if you thought, like an example that I was going to bring up for the cosmological argument, because I do know a bunch of various quantum mechanical scenarios where causality does not appear to be linear.
Yes. Now, so the problem with that is that what often happens in these arguments is that a certain view of what causality is read into the argument, and therefore the argument is being strawmanned. So, I mean, the causality that, say, like an Aristotelian or a Thomist might be thinking of, it need not be deterministic. I mean, there's no requirement that it be deterministic. I mean, certainly there might be many indeterministic phenomena in physics.
Well, yeah, I'm
But
a indeterministic. I
yeah,
don't think the universe is deterministic.
right. So it is conceivable that there might be indeterministic relations between things. But I mean, this doesn't really have any effect upon like the notion of causality as such.
Well, I was gonna.
The problem is, yeah, because the problem with these sorts of objections, like I said, that a certain view of causality is read into the argument, usually from what the latest trends in physics are, and not backing up the question one additional step and asking what causality even is. Like, what are you even talking about when we say causality? Which is a whole separate discussion in itself. But that's the sort of discussion you would need to have to kind of rebut that.
I would say, I might get it wrong because I don't know the exact technical terms, but I guess causation would be ultimately something enacting upon something else in order for it to change.
Mhm.
And I know, because I saw in the argument you said there has to be an actualization and then a potential. It has to be in that order of the actual enacting onto the potential. And then the potential becomes an actualization, and then it acts on another potential, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So this is like the you mean like the act potency conception of change that I was talking about?
I believe so. Yes, you have an actual, and then it acts into a potential to change it.
Yeah. So within that argument, this is a metaphysical view coming from Aristotle. The whole point of the view is try to say what change even is. So just from the start, it's not an attempt at a theory of physics. It's really philosophy of nature. It's trying to say what change even is. So like under the Aristotelian view, there's the act potency distinction. Is divided into the way it is in act and certain ways that it could be given its nature, and those are the potencies. So what changes is the bringing of potency to act, or the actualization of a potential. So under this conception, yeah, the causation looks like potency is brought to act by something else which is already actual. So that's kind of the inference, or the starting point.
Would you say that would have to be a linear relation, or it does not have to be a linear, I guess, again, a temporal way?
Oh, yeah. So that's an interesting question, whether it has to be linear in the temporal sense.
Because I have examples of where there's actualization that's not temporal linearly.
Oh, perhaps you could expand upon that.
So I guess to lay out the couple assumptions made is that you have to, I guess, prescribe to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics that when things are, I guess, in an unobserved state, they exist in I might be butchering it, but in a probabilistic state of being.
Yeah,
they're not determined. There's scenarios like you have the double slit experiment, and then you have a detector at the gate where it's supposed to go through one slit or the other. And what you can do is you could like fire a photon, and if you turn on the detector while it's being fired, you can see it's only going to act like a particle. There's only going to be two lines at the end of the wall. And if you don't have the detector on, you're going to see the wave pattern of form, essentially. Mm-hmm. But where it gets really interesting is, so you initially fire the photon, and let's say it's like 90% of the way to the gate, and then you turn on the detector. Doing that will actually force the particle to be will basically make it act like a particle then, opposed to a wave function. You can do this also with a different scenario where the particle has to go through a 50% mirror first, or like a half mirror, where it has a 50% chance of going through or a 50% chance of being reflected. And you can put detectors after the mirror and put different detectors at different stages. So it would be essentially after the particle would have passed either through the mirror or been reflected, or I guess if you have the Copenhagen interpretation where it's different probabilities separated to be either go through or not, and you turn on the detector, then it actually determines what state it'll go through. So it shows that you can essentially change the path of the particle with events that happen in the future.
Yes. Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying, you're describing the double slit experiment.
It's a little bit, yeah. It's a. I have to go probably look up the study. I'll probably post it in the comments afterwards. Is you can ultimately change the pathway of these particles with future events.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty interesting too. How the causality might work there. I mean, it's certainly. I mean, these are very interesting questions, but what these are kind of asking is more what causality as such even is, and what change even is. It's not. I guess like this metaphysics isn't trying to supplant some particular physical theory. Like it's not proposing some theory of quantum mechanics. You can think of it as a higher level interpretation of the very concepts that are used to even make physical statements.
Yeah, I guess you're saying like these are the base assumptions of how reality works, or not assumptions, but I guess logical statements of how reality works.
Yeah, because I think there are certain concepts that even empirical science needs to have an understanding of, even to function, and it doesn't answer them internally. And one of those is what change even is. I mean, you have to have an understanding of what change is before you even start to do or think about some sort of empirical science. And I would say the same thing is true for causation, what causation even is. This is something like I guess I sense a lot of atheists that they, I'm not trying to bring this position to you, but they often think that every single conceptual debate is going to be settled as an in-house debate within physics, or that all questions in principle can be answered by a physical analysis, and you don't have to move to a higher conceptual level than physics.
I don't believe that, because I do think, because ultimately, like we agreed upon earlier, we don't think there's an infinite regression of characteristics in objects that we observe.
Mm-hmm.
So it ultimately, at some level, it is just because it is, and I guess the different forms of metaphysics would explain why it is, or how it is.
I guess, that's kind of one intuition that a classical theist would certainly have, that at the end of the day, everything has to be traced down to something which is necessary. And we would add the qualification, I think, that it's necessary in itself, as opposed to receiving necessity by way of another. And the question we try to spell out, like, when you, getting back to the, I guess the main thesis of the video is, what can we say about God? Is we try to spell out what that absolute most fundamental level is. Like, what does that have to look like? Like, how is that most fundamental level going to be exemplified in our thought?
I guess how we envision God.
Sure. One example I kind of have in mind is that there are certain consequences, like if you do accept such thought that everything ultimately comes from, or is dependent upon, that which is necessary of itself. One consequence of that is that this thing that we're talking about can't be made of parts. It can't be like a composite entity like you or me, that are at each moment at which they exist, they are assembled in a certain configuration. Then the parts come together into a whole. Like, this can't be true of that which is necessary. And the reason that if it were a composite, it could conceivably be decomposed into its parts, which is why it can't be that sort of composition like the things of our everyday experience. So from that intuition that there is something which has necessity of itself, we try to spell out some consequences of that antecedent, of that assumption.
I guess has the debate occurred if there can be more than one necessity or not?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question too. Whether there can be more than one necessary being, and the answer I would give is no, because if there were more than one, there would have to be some principle which is prior to them by which they're distinguished. So that would violate their being necessary at all, meaning that they're contingent upon something which is more fundamental than they are. So you can't have like more than one necessary being. Just like in that video I was talking about, like the conclusion I drew there was pure act. Like that's the eventual conclusion from that argument. Like there can't be more than one pure acts, because if there were more than one, they would have to be distinguished in some way. And in that way, they would have to be distinguished, say, by a temporal feature or some material feature or some potency which wasn't actualized. But if they're distinguished in that way, that contradicts the very assumption that they were pure act. So the conclusion is, if such a thing exists, there can be only one such thing. There can only be one pure act. There can only be one necessary being in the sense that it has necessity of itself. That's a good point, though, because I think a lot of atheists, they often ask, well, we just go one God further.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. Yeah.
Yes. So one problem with that is, I mean, the retort doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the sort of thing that the classical theist is getting at, if it exists, there can only be one in principle. There can't be like 50 different pure acts. Like it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, if you accept the argument that I gave that there can't be more than one pure act, it wouldn't make any sense to say, I just believe in one less pure act than you. I don't know if you.
And I guess I would guess, because you did address it a little bit, and I guess I would like to hear your explanation why is for the cosmological argument, why not have infinite regression?
Right. Yeah. So I guess were you still referring to that the argument from motion that I was talking about in that video?
Yeah, I guess of the argument from motion, like why does it have to be infinite regression?
Right. Yeah. So
or it can't be
we're
an
talking
infinite
about
regression. That's what I meant.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good question, because remember we were talking there about that linear series of actualizations that you can imagine they extend back in time, all the way back to the primordial events of the universe. So with that argument, we're actually not talking about a linear series of movers and those things being moved. Like, we're not talking about a linear series of actualizations of potentials. What we're actually talking about is more akin to the very conservation of existence for particular things at any moment at which they exist. So what we say is that the distinction there is, to use the technical terms, the linear series that extends backward in time is called an accidentally ordered accidens, and there's another sort of series which is called essentially ordered, which extends vertically, and we call that essentially ordered, or per se. And that series of movers, we would argue, the classical theist would argue, that series of movers which is ordered essentially, because of the key reason that each member in the series derives some sort of power from the previous, that you have to say that it terminates somewhere, because if you don't say it terminates, then you're saying that there's some power being derived, but it's being derived from nothing at all. So
there's good.
Yeah, right.
I was going to ask about that specifically about the actualization and potential. Does the actualization have to essentially have the same amount of energy that's enacted into the potential for this to work?
Same amount of energy?
Yeah, essentially the energy would be conserved, I guess, in this. Like if you took the total energy that happened at the very first actualization, and then you look at it, I guess now, is that they would be equal. All the energy, I guess, summed up in the universe or
I guess again, I would say that this isn't an attempt at like a physical theory. So I guess I'm not certain how the law of conservation of energy would play out here.
Well, I guess ultimately, because we do have an empirical data of saying things do have energy, work is done onto and loses in systems. And if you're saying things move, essentially something would have to act upon it or add work to that system. And so ultimately, it would be you could also kind of phrase it as work is being done upon something, opposed to actualization. You could say work is being added to the potential. And I guess ultimately I don't know if it would matter to say if that transfer of work between each mover would have to be equal to the previous system or not.
Yeah, I guess again, I would say this isn't really this isn't an argument trying to make a claim about the way energy is exchanged, so like between kinetic and potential energy. But perhaps by potential, you're thinking of like potential energy as used in physics.
Well, I was thinking a little bit of, because you say the actualization, I guess, changes the potential in some form. So I guess in a metaphysical realm, what would that mean exactly? To try to wrap my mind around it a bit better.
Yeah. So what it means to actualize a potential is to have change. One example is if you have like a cup of tea sitting out on your desk, and it's actually hot right now, but being a cup of tea, it has certain potencies by virtue of its nature, and the tea could become colder, say if the ambient temperature were cooler, and heat would be drawn from the tea, and the temperature of the tea could decrease. So in that change, we would we're just kind of rephrasing everything in this metaphysical language. We're saying that the potency to be at a lower temperature was being actualized. So I guess we're spelling out a very intuitive thing, just using precise language.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I think, more difficult, I would say, for, I guess, different atheists to have this conversation, and I guess included myself, because we don't exactly know all the terminologies being used exactly.
Yeah, I guess like I was saying, there's nothing really too esoteric about like the act potency stuff, in my opinion. I mean, there are lots of interesting consequences of all of it, and there are certainly many debates in this field of I mean, what this theory of act potency even is. But I don't think it's really getting at anything that's really too difficult to understand. I mean, at least in principle. I mean, like I was saying, there are certain ways that things actually are, and that's how they are in act. But things have certain potencies within them too, like certain things that they could become should certain conditions be obtained, and they actualize the potential of that thing to become something else.
And would you say metaphysics would explain every, I guess, potency or potentials, what something could become?
See, that's an interesting question. I guess if you're asking like, how do we know which potencies things have? I mean, I think that's a question for. I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems like it's a question for physics. Like, well, the ways in which things that actually exist could change. Like, well, why it is that a cup of tea can like increase and decrease in temperature, but it can't do things like grow roots and sprout leaves. Like, there are certain things it can do by virtue of its nature, and certain things that it can't do. There are certain potencies it has, which are not at all arbitrary.
Well, I guess would the abstract realm also contain potencies as well?
Do you mean like? I guess I'm trying to think of an example. Like an abstract realm? Do you mean like a realm of forms or something like that?
I guess kind of like I guess like a little bit what we were talking about earlier. I guess like some mathematical systems, would that have potency or not? Or are those just absolute and unchanging?
I I mean, I guess it would depend on what we're saying these things even are. Like if we're saying that that they exist as ideas in an intellect. I haven't really learned too much about like the theory of intellect and like the on some of these metaphysical systems, but I'm not sure if you would attribute potency to that thing itself. There might be potencies within intellect, within the intellectual faculty, but I'm not sure if you would attribute potencies to these particular things.
So,
But I do think that certain things aren't. There are certainly necessary truths. For example, the Pythagorean theorem, for example, is a necessary truth about right triangles.
yeah, I agree.
But that I guess I would say that receives necessity by way of another.
I guess also because I guess for the abstract realm, if they don't have potency, would that mean the cosmological, I guess, arguments say that the first mover couldn't affect these things? And that's outside the first mover's, I guess, ability. It couldn't change these abstract terms if they have no potency.
Yeah, so they would be necessary truths. I mean, they can't change. Like you can't suddenly make a triangle have four sides. Like it's a necessary truth that a triangle has three sides.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we agree on that point.
I guess also, I guess trying to, I guess related to God again, I guess there's also, I guess, pragmatic truths. Like even the conversation we're having right now, people probably won't change their mind one way or the other, or they do, it probably won't be just this stream, or probably be many, many things. And I do think, especially based off Jonathan Haidt's research of moral foundations theory, is that basically how people view religion and practice religion is heavily dependent on their environment and I guess their moral codes to form groups. So I'm not too sure, like, even if we had this conversation, I'm not sure how it really affects certain people at all. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess maybe you're asking like the psychology of belief, like how people,
Yeah, a
the
little bit.
circumstances by which people change their beliefs.
I guess a little bit, because ultimately, I guess no matter what the truth is of this scenario, is that people are still going to have their interpretations of what God is and isn't, whether it's logical or not.
Oh, sure. But I mean, I think we would all agree that there's well, I mean, you agree that there's a truth in principle, right? I mean, in spite of the fact that people come to different interpretations, that in principle there is,
Yes, I do.
There are truths, right?
I think that has to be true in order, I guess, essentially for science to work, because you would essentially, the models wouldn't be ever increasing in accuracy. It would essentially just constantly change and be, I guess, different in accuracy depending on the time or whatever rules were set out at that moment. So yes, I do believe truths have or objective.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because if you don't affirm that there is such a thing as capital T truth, it's very difficult to say that say physics makes any real progress toward the truth, right? Of course, if there is no truth, there's no way to make that statement. The only thing you can really say that is it's just changing from one preferred theory at one time to another preferred theory at another time. You couldn't really ascribe anything to you couldn't really ascribe progress to anything of the operations of physics.
Be altering, even then, in assuming that in that new system, that time would even have the same characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious. Have you read any of the books like Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing? Like some of the
I haven't, but
like the cutting edge. stuff.
Is it pretty much saying that he kind of goes into virtual particles and explains that even if you have nothing, or like I guess nothing in a sense, that you can't have truly zero energy in any given region at any time, and so you could have a possible fluctuation where you have a bunch of matter and I guess the antimatter created at a moment, and they would just happen to cluster around different parts, but as long as the net is still zero, then it's fine for a universe just to pop out of nowhere.
Something like that. I mean, the book is interesting and worthwhile in its own right, but it's not worthwhile for the thesis of the book, like showing how something can come from nothing. But what's interesting, because I brought that up because it seems that like physicists like Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking, they're trying to search for like the ultimate simplicity possible. They're trying to push things back as far as they can possibly go until you reach something which is, I guess, as we were saying earlier in the stream, it just has to be. It couldn't be otherwise, right?
Yeah, I'm guessing they're
trying to search for that.
The search for the grand unification theory.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that explains everything, how everything works.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because I guess in a way they have a very similar project that a classical theist would certainly recognize, that we're trying to push things back as far as they can go to the most metaphysically fundamental reality possible, and trying to see like what that thing looks like. But it seems like they're doing it kind of in a different way from like starting from physics. Like I said, that was one interesting thing I kind of picked up on this. In these books.
I guess I'm not sure. Like if they're like, let's say we still let's say someone has a mathematical model of a grand unification theory. Like I guess some people have proposed string theory could act like this, and ultimately it's because science is dependent on observation. It's difficult to test such a thing, but all you really have is the mathematical model to predict what will happen. And I guess you would have to put it through various scenarios to see where it's couldn't be as predictive as a model anymore. So I think ultimately, and I think many people will disagree, but I think at least for the model of science is even if you had something like the grand unification theory, I believe it would still have a bounded model. Like there would be areas that it could not predict or could not maintain over. Like there would be things that it could not essentially be able to predict anymore because it would be outside its realm. And I guess you could say that would be the metaphysical then.
I guess I'm not sure if I would say it's the metaphysical. It's just a very very abstract description of physics. But I guess one other point in these books I'm generally not quite sold on is when these guys try to ascribe causal powers to physical laws or laws of nature. Because like I was saying earlier, this point about laws of nature, it's something that people don't really talk about very much, like what a law of nature even is. Because over history, there are many various conceptions of what a law of nature was. Like I think the one you described was kind of like the regularity theory, that what a law of nature is just a description of certain regularities in our experience. But there are other conceptions.
I came to know it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess there's not an established correct answer within philosophy. I mean, I have my own view on it. Obviously, I think my own view is correct, but an interesting alternative view, and it seems to be closer to the view that a lot of these physicists take on board when they want to ascribe causal power to these laws. It's actually a view that comes from theology, specifically Newton, where divine laws these laws of nature were pretty much divine commands. Like when Newton says a law of nature, he means a divine command. But obviously, this can't quite be what physicists are talking about. But I think that's one interesting concept. I think that has been resurrected in modern physics. This idea of a law of nature having causal power, but where that view really comes from is it's a theological doctrine. It's saying that these laws of nature are reflections of God's will.
I guess mostly just because I want to trigger the chat a little bit. Would that be a God of the gaps argument of saying we don't know how these necessities happen, therefore God?
I mean, it could be. I mean, I think. I mean, I hate God of the gaps arguments. I mean, it's kind of funny because the arguments that most often convince people, I think, are actually really bad arguments, like God of the gaps arguments. Like, we can't explain something, therefore we make God do it in this particular instance. So I mean, I guess you and I can agree on that one, that these are bad arguments.
And I guess ultimately, I mean, I think just to throw them under the bus so they can deal with it, I guess Gabriel Lucas and Gary Edwards probably have a better tenacity in order to deal with these concepts than I do, for sure, because I don't usually think in these philosophical terms as much. I think generally it's more of a pragmatic view of how the world works, or I try to. I don't think I'm completely pragmatic at all. I don't think I'm like some rational skeptic. TM.
TM. Trademark.
I guess, but I do know I have biases and yada, yada, yada. I can ultimately use empiricism, and I guess through rationality, some, I guess, rules of logic in order to evaluate that empirical data, find out how it works and relates to each other. And I guess ultimately, I guess with the rational aspect is what I would try to, I guess, communicate is a lot of these models that people use are unbounded, and they try to go further than what's necessary with, I guess, they make assumptions in rationality that's not necessarily true. And because of these assumptions, the models kind of become more and more inaccurate the further you try to test it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can't help but agree with you on the way like science tends to work, like how the empirical sciences tend to work. I mean, I think your description of how they work is, I think, more or less my position too.
Well, that's good, I guess, because I didn't see the debate yet, but for the Distributus and King Crocoduck, so I think they had a disagreement of how science works. And I think I have a similar position to King Crocoduck, I would imagine, but I haven't seen the debate yet.
Yeah, I forget what Crocoduck's position is.
I think it's
Yeah, go ahead.
That it's an ever-correcting model that basically changes itself depending on new information, kind of like a self-correcting algorithm. Is that with new data, it uses that data to correct itself to become a more accurate model. So like an ever-improving system.
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. I guess, did you have any other questions that you had for me? Because I remember you said before the stream that you had a few questions about the like some of the things that I said in my own video.
I guess a little bit is one of the things that I haven't covered yet is trying to look. I guess why would the first uncaused cause have to have divine properties? Because I think that's going to be another video you're going to touch on, but I was a little curious now.
Oh, like the divine attributes?
Yeah.
Well, those are just consequences that we're trying to draw out from what comes out of that argument for motion. Like, if you notice the argument for motion, supposing it does work, the first conclusion that we arrive at is there is something which is purely actual and has no potencies. And from the classical theist point of view, what we try to do after that is try to spell out why this thing has to have certain other properties too. I think we're talking about there being only one pure act in principle. So that would be like an additional argument that I would have to give why there's only in principle one pure act as opposed to being like 50 different ones. Like polytheism, for example, even though this isn't quite polytheism. So from that, what we try to do is spell out a number of other properties that this pure act would have to have. And that's actually one of the divine attributes is unity. Another one is immutability, meaning it can't change. And that one's kind of easy to draw out of the conclusion of pure act because, if this thing were to change, then that would require some actualization of a potency. But there are no potencies in pure act. So if this pure act does exist, it would have to be immutable. So, it's just kind of a logical drawing out of the consequences of what comes out of that first argument.
Understand the properties of this a little bit. You would say, even though this thing actualizes, and then for all the other systems, when something actualizes, it changes in order to act upon a different thing. Would it have to do that for other systems of actualization? Like I guess with the tea, because the tea then because it's in the environment where the surroundings are cooler, so it cools down eventually. So it enacts onto the air and it heats that up, but in process of doing so, it will cool itself down. Or I guess it will transfer, its heat elsewhere. So I guess for the first cause, the process of actualization would not change its, characteristics.
Can you say the last sentence again?
For the uncaused caused, the act of actualization would not change its characteristics.
Yeah, because we would say that it can't change even in principle, because what it changes is an actualization of a potency. And because the thing we arrived at in that argument has no potencies, there are no potencies which could be reduced to act. And so even in principle, this thing can't change at all.
So I'm now gonna, to now really start the how can we talk about God debacle. I'm gonna start asking, a bunch of questions about the uncaused cause to kind of understand the nature of it, so other people can maybe understand and address it in the future.
Sure.
If they wish to do a video response or something. Could the uncaused cause act upon itself?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Certainly it can't actualize some, passive potency within itself.
You said there wouldn't be any potency within itself because it's
right. It's
unchangeable.
Yeah. So I guess I would say if it were to do such a thing, it can't be in the same way that we're describing, like within the argument. It can't just be this bringing of potency to act. It can't be in quite that way. But I guess I'm not quite sure about that one.
And I guess another thing is, because we kind of brought it down to just a simple chain of linear event. I'm guessing, could the uncaused cause multiple things to happen simultaneously? Like there would be the first uncaused cause, and let's say caused then after that 1 trillion different things. Would that be feasible?
I guess there's no. I can't really see any logical contradiction there. You mean many different potencies being actualized?
Yeah, once
simultaneously.
By the single uncaused caused.
Yeah, it seems it would have to be that way because the whole idea of this pure act, it's not so much that it acts once as an agent in the distant past to get things going in the distant past, but the classical theist would say that this operation of pure act is needed for anything in our daily experience to exist at any moment at all. Like there are certain actualizations of potencies that need to happen right now. And in pretty much everything in our daily experience, any natural substance would require this. So actually, we would say that all of these actualizations of potencies have to be traced, every single one of them, because remember, pure act, in my argument, the pure act is unity. There's only one such thing. All of them have to be traced back to the singular thing.
And you're saying it wouldn't have to be traced back in a linear, I guess, time fashion.
Yeah, I guess the way I'm thinking of the tracing is in that hierarchical sense or in the vertical sense. A horizontal meaning like extending backward in time. You can think of vertical as the stuff that has to be the existences that have to be actualized right now, just for things to exist. Like if you go back to that cup of tea, the tea has to have certain potentials to be actualized just to even exist as tea. Like certain the molecules of water have to be in a certain way. The hydrogen atoms have to be bound to oxygen atoms right now. That's a potency that has to be actualized. And you can go down to further and deeper levels of reality. And there are certain potencies which have to be brought to act at every single moment of the existence of the things of our daily experience, just for these things to even exist, even for a moment. So those are the sorts of actualizations of potencies that I guess we would be talking about, not only in this Aquinas' first way, but in what Ed Feser calls the Aristotelian proof in his book, Five Proofs for the Existence of God. Like those are the sorts of actualizations of potencies that we're thinking of, the hierarchical ones.
And I guess for another question that's a hypothetical, if the uncaused caused entered a system where there are caused causes, would any attempt of actualization onto the uncaused caused do anything, or would it just go unnoticed? Like essentially, let's say the uncaused caused entered our world. And then I guess ultimately, would we even notice, because there's no way to change any actualization of this thing, so then we wouldn't even notice if such a thing did enter.
I guess I'm a bit confused on the entering into our world part.
I guess
You mean like a appeared as a physical object?
yeah, I guess if the uncaused caused was a physical object, I guess it wouldn't have to be. But I guess if it was a physical object and it did enter our world, I guess could anything, I guess, in our sense, even know it? Because if it can't basically change the potential to be noticed, or if that's not one of its characteristics to be seen and its potentiality, and because it can't be, I'm assuming that it can't be enacted upon by normal things, correct? Like there's no activation, like I'm assuming like you can't do a circular thing where something can reenact upon the uncaused cause.
Reenact upon it?
Or I guess activate. Yeah, act upon it. Like could something else attempt its activation onto the uncaused cause?
Attempts its activation.
I guess because it doesn't have a potential, so it couldn't do anything with the activation. Like if we're just doing the moving example, and you have the uncaused cause, I guess, enter a system. Like let's just make it simple, like the all of reality just moving particles, and you have this uncaused cause enter the system. Is since it can't be, it doesn't have any potential to change. Is would any of the other, I guess, caused particles even notice this enter the system, because they couldn't enact anything onto the thing because it couldn't change its potential?
Yeah, I guess I'm a bit confused on the specifics of entering as a physical object.
And I guess maybe it's incorrect because I would make assumptions that I guess the uncaused caused would be a physical object in a sense, and maybe that's incorrect.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would argue that a pure act it can't be material. It has to be immaterial because those things which are material have potencies in them.
And would you
they
say
can be dissolved?
And I guess, would you say material things can't enact onto the immaterial?
Material things can't act in the immaterial.
No, I mean material things enact onto the immaterial. Like, could physical objects enact, like, do actualization onto the potentials of the abstract realm?
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure about that one. So you're saying that is there some actuality that's material that actualizes some potential in something which is immaterial?
Yeah.
I think such a thing is posited, like under the Aristotelian Thomistic view of how the intellect works. That there are certain potencies which are immaterial, and those are brought to act. But I could be wrong about that. I could be talking nonsense. I mean, I guess it's conceivable.
I guess, can you explain the Aristotelian view a little bit? I guess the thoughts, like how would that be also immaterial? Because I would imagine currently, especially because you would probably derive a lot of things to be empirical with the brain. And so, like, I guess where would the room be for the immaterial realm to infect one's thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few different arguments for the immateriality of the intellect. There's one interesting argument. I think it connects to what you were mentioning before about how the empirical phenomena seem to underdetermine what's actually going on at the level of abstraction. They don't really determine like a specific formula. So that's actually one premise of the argument for the immateriality of the intellect. So that the empirical phenomena, the physical processes are not quite determinative in that way, that they're underdetermined. But the thing is, there are certain operations in our formal thought which do seem to be very determinative. One example is when we grasp the concept of what it is to square a number that is, multiplied by itself. As soon as we grasp that concept, grasping that concept determines all of the cases where that is a true operation of squaring a number, producing the correct result, and determining the incorrect instances of that. So that is actually completely determinative. So the argument goes that there are certain operations in our formal thought which are determinative in no way that a physical process could be. And the conclusion is there are some operations in our formal intellect. Operations of the formal intellect must be not a physical process. I mean, there are, of course, there are going to be all sorts of objections to that argument. But that's one argument that kind of suggests that there are certain operations of our intellect which could not even in principle be like a physical process just because of that underdetermination.
So I guess a way to, I'm gonna bring a hypothetical. So if you had two identical brains and you basically tested them, and would you say it's there would be some unpredictable behavior between these two, even though they're exactly identical in how they would react to stimuli?
So you're saying if there are two brains and they were the same in all respects?
Yeah, down to the quantum level.
So they were exactly the same.
Yep. I guess their only difference would be location.
Right. So the question is, would the mental events be exactly the same? Like, would like that stream of consciousness be the same?
Yeah, if they experience the same stimuli, would their consciousness, I guess, react? Would it be different? Or like, would it be, I guess, indeterministic is that you would probably have a system of probabilities of how they would react to the stimuli. And I guess a deterministic view would be they would have to act in this certain way.
I guess the like the physicalist would have to say that they would have to be totally determined because they start off in the exactly the same brain state, right?
I'm
So they
not
would have
too
to
sure
react to the
because
stimulus in the same way.
you can still be I guess would it be a naturalist whoever believes in only the physical realm?
Mhm.
Because with quantum mechanics, you can say things exist in a probabilistic nature. So even if you did have two brains that are exactly identical and they're viewed to the same stimuli, you could argue then it would branch out in different probabilistic paths from there. That it wouldn't be deterministic, but you would have a probably like trillions upon trillions of different possible reaction or probabilistic reactions that would occur.
I mean, I guess that's possible. I mean, that would have to be something that the physicalist would have to deal with, like
Well,
this
like it would,
indeterminacy, right?
yeah. I mean, I guess it depends. I guess ultimately how you view the Copenhagen model. If it's, I'm personally indeterministic, is that I do believe even if you have a snapshot of the universe of where every single particle is and the state of what every particle is and how all the space and everything is acting at once, you couldn't predict what's happening in the past or future, even if you had all the knowledge. You could only predict its probabilities of what has happened and what will happen.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure the answer to that. I mean, I happen to think that there are some certain skeptical questions that you can ask, starting from that same assumption that you consider two brain states, which are totally the same, except so like you said that they're spatially separated. So I think the physicalist would have to say that it is totally inconceivable that those two brains be experiencing two different mental states.
I think they
And
could
so the
say it would
argument
still
would
be
run
different because if
that
you,
they could be two different mental states.
yeah, if you believe in probabilistic, the nature of quantum mechanics, like that's still physical. Like, yeah, I
Yeah,
would say there's
but
like Lawrence
yeah,
Krauss is an example. Like, he doesn't believe in God, but he probably believes in the uncertainty of quantum mechanics, or I guess the probabilistic nature of it.
well, I guess in the case of Lawrence Krauss, shouldn't we say that he believes in nothing,
Sure, and I guess
or I guess nothing in quotes? I mean, not in a pejorative sense, but referring to his book, "The Universe from Nothing," or "A Universe from Nothing."
yeah, I think it's a. I haven't read the book personally, but yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit. It's the basically the if you could observe the entire universe and if the net energy is zero, then you could uh, then presume his arguments of saying then it was just a quantum fluctuation within the vacuum energy, and it just happened to have separated these large amounts of energy. So if you summed up everything to be zero, then it would be possible with the current models that we have. I think that's what his argument is.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's very interesting in its own right. I don't think it answers the question that he thinks it answers. That it shows that something can come from nothing, where nothing is understood in the metaphysical sense, like not anything. I mean, nothing can't be some fluctuation in something else in a prior physical state
Yeah, I
because
don't think
there's
he
already
goes
something.
that
Yeah,
far. He just talks in, I would say, in completely, I guess, empirical terms. Like, we know these. I guess he's trying to extrapolate models, essentially, kind of like a. I don't know how far the model can go. Essentially, like what he's proposing. It's
mm.
ultimately like he's assuming the universe already existed in these certain states, and then ultimately because of the laws that we know currently and how they work and how they behave, and I guess how predictive and how they behave, then you could extrapolate a universe coming from those principles, or I guess presumptions. But I guess ultimately, I guess the things that establish the presumptions would still be up to question.
Yeah, I mean, like we were saying earlier, and I would have to question what exactly he means when he describes like causal powers and creating powers to these laws. Because obviously he can't mean a law of nature or law of physics in the Newtonian sense, where that has an explicit theological connotation of a direct command by God. So of course he can't be talking about that. But then again, if he's talking about just a regularity, I mean, the regularity doesn't explain why things are created. The regularity just describes the regularities in that which already exists. Right. So I mean, you kind of have to work out like what exactly he's talking about with a law of nature.
I would say he's basically talking. So I would say a lot of atheists probably think in these terms. So I'm going to try to, I guess, relate is that you're thinking in terms of you have the empirical model, and I guess you have basically the logical axioms that you deduct from these models. Like you assume these certain things to happen because you observed these things to happen. And because of that, you can model different kind of forms of what reality could be or could have been if under these certain situations. Kind of like, I guess with Lawrence Krauss, like if you at one point had a universe that had nothing in it, and you still have these virtual particles that can exist, then if you just wait an incredibly long time, I might be misrepresenting the argument because I don't know how he deals with how time came to be.
Mhm.
Is you as long as the net like the net energy of the universe would be zero, like you found every particle and you accumulated all their momentums and it would be zero, and you got all the energy and found the anti-pair for each particle, then it'd be okay.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's very interesting in its own right. I mean, he could be correct in how this is how the primordial events of the universe played itself out. That there were these conservation laws like of momenta and energy, and there were these very basic things like virtual particles that existed. But I mean, of course, the objection I raise is that this isn't nothing. This isn't something coming out of nothing. But I guess one thing I would emphasize from the point of view of the classical theist is that a lot of the arguments that we propound aren't quite convinced with what happened in the primordial events of the universe. Like when we say that necessary being or pure act acts as an agent, what we mean is more along the lines of a sustaining cause, like a cause which sustains the existence of everything at any moment at which it exists. So this pure act is acting all the time, not just at one particular moment back then at the beginning. I guess like a deist would say, because I guess they would say something like God acted once in the beginning, like he's a divine watchmaker. He he wound up the spring and he just let it go. And there were these quote laws of nature unquote, and they just kind of let themselves play out, and nature just guides itself, but it doesn't need any sort of sustaining cause. Whereas a classical theist would say, no, there's a constant action on the part of pure act as a sustaining cause, not just as a one-time generational cause. If that makes any sense.
I believe so. So I guess hypothetical would be if the uncaused cause stopped, I guess, actualization on every other potential in the universe, it would, I guess, cease having potential. Like it wouldn't do anything afterwards once the uncaused cause was, I guess, unaffecting any of them.
Yeah, we would say that if the first cause or first principle, or however you like to phrase it, or pure act, if that stops acting, like right now, then things would just be annihilated, because things don't have this they don't have this ability to make themselves exist of their own power. And there are precise reasons for saying that, because things are composed of act and potency. Things are composite in nature. They need to be assembled in the right way right now. So there needs to be a continuous action, a sustaining action on the part of pure act at every single moment. Because, and if there weren't this sustaining action, things would just be annihilated at this point of view, under the classical theistic picture.
I guess would it have to be enacted, I guess, in a temporal sense that it's literally happening at every single moment, or would it be more of enacted on a grand, kind of like if you unfolded all of time, it would just enact onto that particle or system or whatever it is enacting upon just throughout that thing throughout I guess eternity.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly we wouldn't say that that pure act operates at every single moment of time in a number of discrete ways in that manner. What we would prefer saying is that pure act is not measured by time and exists metaphorically outside of time, but acts in such a way as there being things at each moment in time. So it's kind of like a semantic rephrasing of what's going on, but you can think of the action on the part of pure act as one singular unfolding of one continuous act, and not as like discrete actions.
And I guess also you would allow many activations to perform on a single potential would be allowed to happen.
So you're saying there's some potency and then it's actualized by many different things?
Yeah, is that allowed?
I guess it would be. I mean, there might be something you might perhaps you need like actualization by many different things to raise a certain potential to act.
Well, I guess not just to raise it to the potential to act. I guess just form of potential. Like it could just be something as simple as two billiard balls hitting another billiard ball at the same time. Like that's enacting one action, but it's two different activations to enact one potential.
Oh, sure.
And I guess ultimately, you would say the uncaused cause would have to be, I guess, using this actualization at any given moment on any potential in order for it to maintain its properties.
Well, I think there are some potentials which they require actualization at each moment at which things exist. Like certain things need an actualization of the potential for their existence. And that has to be concurrent at every single moment at which they exist under this theological picture.
I guess, can you give an example?
Oh yeah, like going back to like that, like the cup of tea, for instance. So the tea only exists insofar as the potential for the water to exist is actualized, but the water only exists insofar as two hydrogen atoms are bound to an oxygen, which requires an actualization of a potential. And if that fails to actualize, then the tea doesn't even. I mean, the water doesn't even exist, and therefore the tea doesn't exist. So there's this kind of internal dependency of one step upon the other. And even within that bounding of the atoms to one another, there are other potencies that need to be actualized just for the internal structure of the atoms to hold together. And then I guess you can descend to the deeper and deeper levels of reality. There are certain potentials that need to be actualized to make things hold together at that level too. So the end result of this is, I guess I would say, is that the actualizations of these potencies, because they're in that hierarchical and dependent manner, it has to terminate in something which is pure act, which just is already actual and doesn't need itself some sort of potential. It doesn't need some sort of actualization of a potential of its own to exist. So the thing which terminates this hierarchical series of movers, this would have to be purely actual. It wouldn't need its existence actualized like the other things in that series. If that makes any sense.
I guess also to further question for the abstract, would that need the constant interference of the uncaused caused to maintain its properties, or would those, I guess, logical laws always maintain its properties no matter what the uncaused cause did?
So you mean like an abstract truth, which is like
Yeah,
necessary?
yeah,
For
like
example, yeah, maybe like the Pythagorean theorem,
yeah,
for
or
example.
yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, so this would be predicated upon how we understand abstract objects. Like I was saying earlier, there are many different views, there's like the realist and nominalist and the conceptualist view. Like my own view is that these ideas exist in a way in the divine intellect, but they receive necessity from their existence in the divine intellect. So they already have necessity, so they couldn't possibly be otherwise. But they've received their necessity by virtue of their existing within the divine intellect.
So you're saying it's part of the uncaused cause, these abstract concepts that are, I guess, logical laws.
Yeah, I guess these abstract truths. Like again, I would say that these abstract things can exist in two different ways: either instantiated in actual things, like triangularity can be instantiated in actual material triangles. Like if you take a chalkboard and you draw a triangle with chalk on there, there's an instantiation of a triangle there. And there are many other instantiations of triangles you can find all over the place, like pyramids. So they can either exist in that way as instantiated things, or they can exist as ideas in a mind. And they can exist as ideas in our minds too. It doesn't have to be the divine intellect. Under this view, I mean, of course, like when I say that they exist as an idea in the divine intellect, that requires a further argument too. I'm just kind of giving the end result of my reasoning on this.
Yeah, I think I'm, I guess, a little bit ultimately, I guess, trying to dissect a little bit about this. So hopefully, I guess, other people can help understand as well.
Yeah, I mean, these are all good questions because perhaps you can kind of notice that each one of these questions is dependent upon the understanding of several other concepts too. Like when you ask that question about how do abstract objects exist in this view, that's contingent upon understanding what abstract things even are. Like, are we going to be a realist about this? Are we going to be a nominalist? Are we going to be a conceptualist? And even when you ask a question about what a law of nature is, that requires further interrogation of what a law of nature even is and how that relates to this classical theistic picture. So I guess this whole thing, this whole classical theistic picture, it kind of comes as a package deal. Like you need other concepts in place, and you have to understand all of these other things and how they relate to one another. You can't just like pick one out and analyze that in its own right. Like everything's kind of interconnected as like an intellectual system.
I guess to add on, I guess a way to see if these systems work, I guess for the classical theist, is you would probably look at each individual, I guess, line of logic and see how it applies, and I guess try to see how accurate it is in explaining the model. Or because I guess you're trying to explain the nature of reality, right?
I guess if I were to sum up like what the world we're trying to do here is we're trying to identify what the most metaphysically fundamental reality looks like, what the most metaphysically prior reality looks like, or that, to put another way, we're trying to identify whether we can trace the dependencies of the things of our daily experience back to something. And if we can, we're trying to spell out like what that something looks like. And that's like where all the talk of the divine attributes comes in.
Because I also guess because I think I saw someone pointed out in your comment section because a lot of people brought up quantum mechanics but didn't bring up too many scenarios. Like I would say like what I noticed for the cosmological argument is that it for most of the times that I've seen, but it's probably just because most of the philosophers who use the argument were just from a couple hundred years ago or even further, is that they just assumed time was linear, so they didn't, I guess, prepare that it could be, I guess, dependent on different factors as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly knowledge has changed over time, but I mean, if you like a good reference to look at for some of the best arguments and the most detailed explication of the classical theistic picture is Ed Feser's book, Five Proofs for the Existence of God. And if you kind of take a close look at the structure of the arguments there, they don't really explicitly involve time. I mean, time isn't really an important issue there. I mean, it might come up as an issue as a matter of an accident, but it doesn't seem like it's essentially an issue there.
I do have a scenario, and I would like to, because it does depend if you believe in special relativity and the Copenhagen interpretation, is that there is an odd scenario where you could have two objects that are both simultaneous at the same time, both being the actualization and potential of each other.
Yeah, I guess I would have to ask you to further spell the scenario you have in mind.
So I guess I might mispronounce the name, but I guess have you heard of the Lorentz transformation equations for special relativity?
Yeah, the coordinate transformation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess to explain a little bit to the chat, and is ultimately you can have different spaces, like you can have different locations, and basically simultaneity is relative. Certain events won't occur at the same time according to certain observers that are moving at relative velocity to each other. They will observe basically states happening at different occurrences at different points of time. And so this is probably like one of the first equations that developed that kind of showed that space and time are very related to each other. So ultimately, you can, to explain it in a very, very simple way, if you're moving at some velocity, things that are further ahead of you happen sooner than things that are closer to you. Those events would occur before the things closer to you. So ultimately, you set up a scenario where you have two entangled particles, and let's say it's a particle pair that's created. So when you observe it, one's going to be spin up and one's going to be spin down. And the idea of entanglement, when you observe one, it instantly collapses the wave function of the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you do is you separate these particles by some distance. And then you have two observers. One is going towards one particle at some velocity, and the other one, which is going the opposite direction, is going towards the other particle in some velocity v. And if, I guess, both laboratories decided to observe at noon when they're at the same inertial frame of reference, so they're not moving relative to each other, the two particles, the two observers will disagree who observed the particle first to collapse the wave function. One observer will say, no, the one farther away from me observed first and collapsed the wave function, but the other person will disagree and say the other person observed the particle first to collapse the wave function. So I believe because I'm actually wording it a little poorly, because people don't usually say cause in this scenario. They just say an absolute anti-correlation, because there is no real way to have a cause and effect, because you're essentially saying both particles cause the other one to collapse its wave function, depending on what scenario you observe, because you have a scenario where you assume that communication can happen faster than the speed of light.
Yeah.
So that would be a scenario where you would have, depending if you view the particles, if you view the causation being that they cause onto each other and not the principle that you have to conserve momentum, if you view it as up or down for the particle pair. Because if you view the particles have to, actualize each other to change its wave function, then it wouldn't make sense as much because they would both be the actualizations and potentials for each other. But I guess if you viewed it more of in a certain metaphysical sense, where you have this necessity property where you have to conserve momentum, therefore it caused these particles to be absolutely anti-correlated. No matter, temporally, it wouldn't matter where it is. It just has to necessitate that property. And I guess there's no real, currently any empirical way to test that. It would just be an abstract concept to model it.
Yeah, I mean, like with this quantum mechanical stuff, I haven't really thought. Is this the EPR paradox?
What's the EPR paradox?
I thought that was one where you have like two quantum states which are entangled. One's and then you separate them such that if there were some sort of causal interaction between, like an action at a distance, you have to proceed faster than the speed of light.
Well, they've measured this already. They've done studies where they measured the time difference and they separated it, and it was, for the differences, even with the technology that we used, was faster than light.
Yeah, I think I saw this from instantaneous, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's what it essentially is, because I guess mathematically, because you collapse, because there's because usually it's like spin up or spin down is one way you would observe it. Mm-hmm. And if you have a particle pair created, you would have to conserve momentum in the universe. So one would have to be spin up. That means that would necessitate that the other one would have to be spin down.
Yeah.
And since if you use the Copenhagen model, is that while it's in its probabilistic state, neither are in spin up or spin down. They're just in a probabilistic state of being spin up or spin down until an observation has occurred or something to basically collapse its wave function.
Yeah.
And so I guess in that sense, would from a metaphysical standpoint, would you have to say that the actualization would have to be from a more fundamental tier to enact under these particles, or would you say it's all right for both particles to be the actualizations and potentials of each other?
Well, I mean, the key metaphysical thing I think we would have to be on the lookout for is something can't be act and potential. It can't be in potency and in act in the same way, because then it would have to simultaneously be and not be.
Well, let's go. I guess the scenario, I guess, with the assumptions that made the relativity is true, the Copenhagen model's correct.
See, one thing about the Copenhagen interpretation too, it seems that like even within physics, there doesn't seem to be a consensus there as to which interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct. I think I heard Sean Carroll say that people who tend to think about the philosophy behind quantum mechanics, they tend to not agree with the Copenhagen interpretation. I mean, there are some other reasons that one might not agree with the Copenhagen interpretation too, because it essentially leads to idealism.
Why would it lead to idealism?
Oh, that would be a whole separate discussion. That because things don't exist until they're observed. So if they're not being observed, they really don't exist. So they don't exist as ideas, really. I've heard the criticism that this idealism is actually baked in as assumptions to the Copenhagen interpretation. That the assumptions that if it's not being observed by something, that it doesn't exist, that assumption conjoined with things exist in a superposition, that these are just presupposing idealism. Which I mean, idealism is it's not. I mean, it's extremely controversial in its own right.
I guess it's a little odd because I guess this is also as a bit of a tangent, but I guess it's something I guess what I ask you is anytime there's kind of a new model to describe reality that comes out of science, like whether it's quantum mechanics or I guess especially relativity, because I guess that's where postmodernism came from ultimately, is I guess, do you think it's a little odd? Because like what I always found odd about the postmodernism thing is like they say how it describes sort of special relativity, but special relativity is still a deterministic model. So why would they describe everything in relative terms of saying truths can be relative?
Yeah, I guess I'm not too sure whether I mean the postmodernists, these guys are a little bit wild, so they probably pick up all sorts of things. I remember back in college I was reading some essays on the moral relativism. I think it was actually Gilbert Harman specifically, and this kind of comes from like an excessive modern fascination with physics, and he was trying to make the case that moral relativism can be legitimate in an analogous way that the relativity between reference frames is a coherent thing in physics. So he was trying to motivate the coherency of moral relativism by way of highlighting how great special relativity and general relativity were.
I mean, I guess this is. I
mean,
like, I guess
really fallacious, but
I guess it'd be like a critique of some philosophers. Do you think they basically misinterpret how some models work? Like, I guess they would make a logical presupposition that wouldn't be there, and then basically use that misconception of logic a bit too far and try to apply it.
Is there like an example that you have in mind?
I guess the postmodernism thing, like saying truths are relative, because they don't know that relativity is still deterministic.
Yeah, I mean these guys have gone off the deep end. It's postmodernists, you know.
But I guess ultimately, because then how would you go to, I guess, these philosophers that would say that ultimately, like you could have in the same universe that is consistent, have two different logical axioms that contradict each other but still be true?
Two different logical systems.
Well, like, because they say truth is relative, right?
Oh yeah, well, that seems to be wasn't that incoherent in of itself, saying that truth is relative? So that statement would have to be. Well, you have to ask: is that statement true or false? If it's true, it's got to be true relative to something else. So I mean, it seems incoherent by infinite regress.
I guess I don't know too much about infinite regress, so I'll just assume it's right.
I mean, a lot of these. I mean, I'm sure there's some way you can wiggle out of that, of like the infinite regress part, but some of the stuff it just seems to me to be incoherent.
And I guess because ultimately, I'm going to guess if there are any other atheists, they're probably going to say to you that you're just using a bunch of philosophy jargon to justify your belief in God. And I have seen that in a lot of comment sections. I think this is why you wanted to have the discussion, to try to get past that a little bit. So I guess then how would you convince them and try to say your points, because you're putting out an argument and they just say you're using this just to justify your reasoning and they don't accept your standard of evidence, then I guess what can you do?
I mean, I guess I don't see the objection there. I mean, the atheist would like the theist to justify his position using some sort of logical argument. And the classical theist, not just the classical theist, but I mean, any theist is going to try to justify his position with a philosophical analysis. So, I mean, once that is given, they can't just turn around and say, oh, well, you're just justifying your position with this philosophy stuff. I mean, isn't that what the atheist expects the theist, though? I guess I don't quite see why that's an objection. I mean, it would be an objection if perhaps an objection would be that I'm trying to obfuscate something.
I guess because ultimately, I think for the most, from what I've seen, a lot of atheist position is ultimately is that it's down to empirical data is how one ultimately gains knowledge. And if they think, I would imagine ultimately if you just use pure rationality, like in the pure deductive sense, is most of the time, I would imagine people make their own presuppositions, and since you're talking about metaphysical concepts, there's no way to essentially test those presuppositions if need be, other than saying these is the nature of the world, so it is because it is essentially.
Well, I mean, the problem here is that this empiricist is expecting the same to apply at all levels of analysis. Like the way we test something in either day-to-day experience or when we're doing physics isn't the same sort of test that we're trying to do at the philosophical level or even at the mathematical level too. I mean, like, when you're trying to establish whether something is true, you have to establish the method in correspondence to what it is that you desire to show or disprove. I mean, the problem here is that you have this. I mean, it kind of sounds like this scientism, where one method is extracted from some domain of study and it's being applied universally across all possible domains of inquiry, and eventually
I think
crosses up to the level of metaphysics. Like people expect metaphysics to be amenable to this very sort of analysis. But there's a more fundamental issue here: is that when the empiricist makes the claim that all knowledge is only known through sense data, I mean, how does he know such a thing? I mean, what sense data confirmed that? I mean, these standards are being proposed. Yeah, these standards are being proposed, but they're not ever being justified. If they're not justified, it's just straight up question begging against the arguments.
I guess it would
how I
be
respond to that.
how you would empirically test the empirical models would be to basically see the accuracy of its predictive capability.
Sure.
Like we know physics works because I guess ultimately you can test these systems and see how accurate it is. So that I guess that would be
that's true. Yeah, I mean that's true to an extent. I mean there might be some problems with that point of view too, because if you're just going by sheer pragmatism, there are plenty of false models which will do the job just as well.
Well,
for example,
the gold digger
if you have
problem.
A certain goal. Oh yeah. The gold digger problem. I was actually going to bring up Ptolemy's geocentric system. Like for some purposes, the geocentric system, the way Ptolemy modeled it, it's perfectly fine. I mean, the math predicts things very well. I mean, it's a totally false model. I mean, we know it's false. But I mean, if you're just going by sheer pragmatism, I mean, there's got to be something more to it than just pragmatism.
Well, I guess that's the kind of like the scenario, like I said, with the fish bowl, the race of super intelligent fish and the people. It's ultimately you can basically test to see which model is to kind of solve the gold digger problem a little bit. You could basically try to test each independent variable if it's possible, but I do understand there's probably will be scenarios that you could never empirically test. And so you would probably have to do by proxy is that you would have you would, I guess, essentially make metaphysical assumptions. And then you would have a system of metaphysical assumptions and you would test these assumptions to see how predictive they are. Even though you couldn't directly test it, but you would, I guess, test the outcome to see if it works or not.
Yeah, I guess. Well, with metaphysics, especially, the goal is not predictive accuracy. I mean, the goal ideally is truth and wisdom. I mean, those are lofty goals.
Fundamental properties, right?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, we're concerned with what we're saying, whether it's true or not. I mean, if you want to be like a, I mean, I understand like in some engineering applications that pragmatism is going to suffice, just because that's all you care about. But the point there is that that's not a standard that should be applied universally. That's a restriction that you're imposing on yourself just so you can focus your attention on a limited range of phenomena and dealing with them in their own right. But the mistake that I think a lot of naive empiricists make is they take one mode of testing, like that which you would use to verify whether the cat is on the mat, like an empirical proposition, and they go mad with it. They say that this is the standard that must be used throughout all philosophical analysis. But I think this can't be right.
That's where I would disagree a little bit, is because I do think at least some people understand that for science, at least, depending on the field, is that it can only be essentially predictive in, I guess, it's certain category. Like physics does pretty good, but no one's a quantum mechanic and then just prescribes you with medication to take. There's just no way. So you're going to end up using different models to basically adjust to different scenarios, like on a macro or microscopic scale.
Well, I guess just one point I would make on that point of testing. I guess, would you agree in principle that, like, say you had like a mathematical proposition, like suppose you wanted to prove the Pythagorean theorem true. The way to prove that true, like the way a reasonable person should be convinced of the truth of that theorem, is not through empirical testing. Like it's through a different mode of inquiry. Like because we desire to prove a mathematical theorem true, we use a different mode of inquiry. Like there, we need a mathematical proof. We need like an abstract proof. And
yeah, I would
not suffice for that. It's like an empirical demonstration.
So I guess I'll try to differentiate the rational and empirical, I guess, ways of proof. I guess so. For the rational way to prove Pythagorean theorem is you would set up. You would have all these logical axioms. You say, because of this, and because of this, and because of this, and because of this, this is true. And you would show how that system relates to each other. And then you could prove by virtue of all the different logical systems interacting with each other and it being consistent that the Pythagorean theorem is true. And I guess how you would test Pythagorean theorem in an empirical sense, it wouldn't be perfect. It would be more of a good enough scenario. Like you would try to find, like you would look at the different logical axioms you would in the rational sense as well. And you would try to best fit a scenario to fit those logical axioms. Like if you have basically a flat space, so you don't have it on a curved space, to have a triangle that's like more than 180 degrees or less than 180 degrees. And you would essentially, with the best tools and measurements you would measure the different characteristics of this triangle and then basically come to a model and say, basically Pythagorean theorem with this percentage of margin of error is correct in an empirical sense, but you would never be absolutely sure.
I guess, but my response to that is that I can do better. I mean, I can actually prove with certainty by a geometrical proof that this proposition is true, whereas you can only do it probabilistically. And furthermore, the Pythagorean theorem is a statement about infinitely many triangles. It's not just like a finite collection of them. So even in your empirical sense, I mean, how many triangles can you possibly test in? I mean, you can't test infinitely many triangles, especially uncountable infinity many triangles.
Like,
and you can't measure them to the accuracy that the truth of the Pythagorean theorem would require in many numerical cases.
So I guess what it would be ultimately, I guess in an empirical sense, you would sufficiently test enough, and this is going to be subjective to certain degrees depending on what you're doing, is that you would test the triangle's properties enough to kind of determine, hey, every triangle we've tested has these properties, so we're just going to assume that every triangle has these properties. Like you would probably write it as a law in the universe then. And then I guess if you found a triangle, even though you never would, found a triangle that didn't have these properties, that still followed the exact same logical axioms as the rational realm.
Mm-hmm.
Because I guess the rational realm could at least prove then under these scenarios of logical steps that are consistent with each other, you will never find a triangle that don't have these properties. But I guess ultimately, I guess the empirical form is it would basically go towards that solution, but never be determinate or absolute in its certainty.
Right.
And I think that's I did watch the distributed video, like he was talking about how he I guess he said he was no longer an atheist because he was questioning, I guess, the different, I guess, confidences of science, essentially.
Yeah.
And I kind of viewed it differently because I think he kind of viewed it as science being an unbounded model where it can predict everything that needs to. But I don't think you should think of science in those terms because there's many different fields, and each of the fields have their own kind of specific instances of where to look upon. Like, I mean, essentially, unless you have the computer the size of the universe and you have the grand unification model, I don't think you should really have any unbounded model to try to describe everything.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I certainly have my points of agreement and also my disagreement with the distributed video on that topic. I mean, everyone has different views on what science consists of, and how it does operate and how it should operate. One example that came to mind, like in your talk of empirical testing, is I mean, there are many mathematical statements that we know to be true because we've proved them, but that you might reach a false conclusion if you were to do this sort of empirical testing. One example, because it's kind of it's famously very non-intuitive, is the harmonic series, which is a infinite series consisting of 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/3 plus 1/4.
Yeah, and you get negative 112 or something.
Oh yeah, that's actually a different thing. That's
the 1 plus 2
integers.
plus 3 plus 4, blah blah
right.
blah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was thinking the wrong one.
I mean, that's yeah. I mean, that one's interesting in its own right because I mean, like when people say that's Numberphile, it's a popular mathematics channel that got criticized for this. When you say that divergent series is equal to a divergent series is just a series that doesn't converge.
And
when you say that's equal to negative 112, you don't quite mean that in the same way when you say that, for example, 1 plus 1/2 plus a 4th plus an 1/8 and so forth.
Yeah, it converges into
2.
Yeah.
Right. But like where you may be empirically misled, like through calculation, is if you take the divergent series, 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/3 plus a 4th plus a 5th and so forth. Again, that's called the harmonic series. This provably diverges. The problem with this is it very, very slowly diverges. And by computation, you can't really... a lot of people get screwed up on this because oftentimes when you learn calculus, you learn to prove that this diverges. And some inexperienced students, they'll try to prove that it converges by computation, which is a famous fallacious way of reasoning in mathematics. Like you don't prove... You don't prove like whether infinite series converge or diverge by punching things into your calculator. But with this series, like you can punch in like thousands upon thousands of terms, and it looks like the series kind of slows down. It looks like it goes to a number, but in fact, it diverges so slowly you can't really tell that it does actually diverge.
Like there's it's that certain bugle. I forgot the name of the bugle, but it's basically
that's
surface area is infinite, but its volume is finite.
Oh, is that Gabriel's horn or something?
Trumpet or something, or Gabriel's horn, yeah.
I remember that was that it's infinite in surface area but finite in its volume?
Yeah. So you could fill it up with paint, but you could never paint the surface.
Right. Yeah, I forget that. I haven't proved that though. Well, I'll have to return to Gabriel's horn. I just looked up on that. Wikipedia. But yeah, that's another example where, like, when you want to come to knowledge about some of these abstract propositions, the right way to quote unquote test them is not through an empirical examination of them step by step. I mean, the better way, I mean, we know it's a better way because we can reach absolute knowledge on this. Like, we can come to definitive statements like about the Pythagorean theorem, about the divergence of the harmonic series, about the finitude of the volume of Gabriel's horn, but the infinitude of the surface area. We can come to those statements absolutely.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I think to try to bridge the gap, I guess, between rationalist and I guess pure rationalist and pure empiricist is, I think rationalism is basically, if you apply it correctly, would be the language of logic. Like these are how logic works, and this is how you apply it. And basically, for empiricism, you would use the language of logic to explain the world, but it won't be absolute in your certainty of it, because you can't test it to the degree of abstracts where you can know the exact property of every single detail once you have it in a rational realm. In an empirical realm, you can only determine so much of what you can know and what your constraints are.
Mm-hmm.
So you would use rationality, I guess, to explain these concepts, and you would use these modes of logic and reason to explain these happenings, but it would never be absolute.
I guess you're contrasting rationalism and empiricism there. I guess in the history of philosophy, I've never quite understood like why we've got to be so radical about these positions. Like, why not be like a sitting centrist? I mean, let's combine best of both worlds. I mean, I do believe that our sense data gives us reliable indicators of the world. Affirm that everything has to be proved abstractly in this matter. I mean, we come to knowledge through our sense experience.
Yeah,
I certainly affirm that. So I guess I wouldn't consider myself like pure rationalist or pure empiricist.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself pure in any other, I guess, rationalist or imperialist. But I guess ultimately, like, I guess for how the atheist would view, like, how does one, I guess, if you ultimately how one would gain knowledge, like how you would even test a logical assumption someone made is that they would assume you would have to test it empirically to know for absolute certainty, or not, I guess, because it's empirical, it's not absolutely certain, but to know to a very high degree of certainty if this logical assumption is in fact true.
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite certain on what it would look like to test one of these fundamental logical axioms. Like I was saying earlier, there are certain arguments for why we cannot doubt things like the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction.
Oh, I'm sorry.
For the reason that
I disconnected for a little bit. Can you, I guess, say what you were saying for the last 30 seconds?
Oh, yeah. Like we were saying earlier, I guess I'm not quite certain of what it would mean to test these fundamental laws of logic. Just because it seems like in the very test of doing, performing the very test, you would have to have already accepted some logical truths, such as the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction. I mean, it seems like there are certain things that we just can't really doubt. I mean,
like you would say, you would have to enact, I guess, these necessities onto, I guess, the empirical realm in order to gain information from it.
Yeah, it's not like knowledge that's not being extracted. Knowledge of that logical truth isn't being like extracted from the empirical realm. So there, it seems like seems like you're doing the.
I think I disconnected for a second.
No.
Sorry about that. So I guess ultimately,
that's all right.
You're, from what I heard, it's ultimately, like, in order to gain information, I guess at least in the empirical realm itself, you would have to have these logical axioms be in place just in order to even test these logical systems, even though it's assuming to be true in order just to test it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to have this stuff on board already.
And I know it's completely hypothetical, and you're allowed just to say it's bonkers because it's bonkers, but what if you observed something that contradicted a logical axiom?
Which one?
I guess any of them.
I mean, I guess I would doubt the experience before I doubted the logical truth itself.
So I guess you would, and I think this is where, probably where the theist and atheist will disagree greatly, is ultimately, I would say for the atheist, you would have to say your certainty comes down to the, sorry, I was messed up for a second. Your certainty ultimately comes down to the empirical realm. And that's how you increase your certainty of the world. And I guess from probably your position, the classical theist, is your certainty is dependent on these rational logical axioms, but they can't be proven empirically, but they're true by the necessity for these logical statements to be true just for the world to work.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, I guess again, I wouldn't say that I'm not like one of these hyper rationalists. Like I don't think you could just sit in your armchair and deduce everything and gain all the knowledge about the world. Like there are certain things. Like I mean, you have to take a look. I mean, you have to use your sense apparatus. And just so I can do a little shilling for Thomism here. Actually, it's not quite rationalistic in this sense. I guess that would be kind of an anachronism to call it either rationalistic or like an empiricist. You're still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh yeah, it looks like one of the two of you just dropped.
It's still the same me.
Yeah,
hopefully it wasn't echoing then.
That might be a logical contradiction. Like you can exist in two places at once.
I guess.
But I guess one of the principal statements you might hear from Thomists is that whatever is in the intellect was first in the senses. So I mean, certainly in this classical theistic tradition, we have a great respect for empiricism, but I guess we wouldn't say it's not the empiricism of, say, David Hume or John Locke, because I mean, at least in my studies so far, our sensory apparatus is much richer than these empiricists think it is. Like we gain much more knowledge about the way reality is than these than like the empiricism of John Locke or David Hume would suggest.
And I guess just
but I could be totally
what
wrong
would their empiricism be? Because I'm not too familiar with all their work.
Oh, like David Hume, for example, he was one of the big empiricist skeptics. So he had some doubts about like whether we can know things like necessary connections like causality and even abstract objects for the reason that he said that you can't see the cause. It's not like there's some goo that like flows from one billiard ball into the next when they collide on the pool table. Like you can't see that cause as a distinct thing in your imagination. So he had some doubts about these metaphysical categories, about like what causation is and even about what abstract objects are, because you can't like directly see any of these things. But the problem is like the skepticism goes way too far. That?
Or are you saying like yeah?
Let's see. So he died in 1776. So we're talking like 1700s here.
I guess I might mess up the model, but I thought the standard model, I guess essentially, you probably wouldn't call it goo, but you would say for every particle interaction, in order, I guess, for these interactions to occur, there is I guess it's probably the incorrect term, but like basically a particle to communicate the interaction between these two particles in order for, I guess, a change to happen.
Like a particle that mediates the causal interaction?
Yeah, through the, I guess, 4 fundamental forces.
I guess I'm not quite sure I'd say that. Again,
Well, I guess that would be kind of the causal, I guess, thing between causes, like at a very fundamental level. I guess if it was Hume's or something. Like if you saw it down to that level, like you could see I know you literally can't see it, but a photon being exchanged between electrons in order for a force to occur.
Well, I mean, certainly physics can spell out how these interactions occur at the level of the details, but again, like what I'm talking about, like with causality, that's a more prior concept in the philosophy of nature.
Like, I guess the necessity of why these things would occur, even in physics.
Yeah, I mean, even with that exchange of a virtual particle, like why that constitutes a causal interaction at all? Like, what is it about exchanging particles that makes causal interactions work? I mean, that doesn't like quite solve the picture. It doesn't really pose an objection for any of this talk of causality that I've been talking about.
I do think it would. Yeah, because I do think even with that, you would ultimately go back to it is because it is. Kind of argument like their properties are this just because it's this. And I guess the Hume's is what you said.
Hume?
Yeah, Hume. I guess his form of, I guess, skepticism would be I guess, until it's empirically observed, there's no certainty whatsoever.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I guess I would have to ask, like, well, what specific statement in like any of the arguments this would be contradicting? Because I mean, the sorts of statements you would have to reject, like if you take that that argument for motion I was talking about earlier, either Aquinas's formulation or Phaser's formulation, the sorts of things you'd have to deny are things like the reality of change, like whether change happens at all, which I would say is undeniable that change occurs. It's a real feature of the world. Or that certain potencies are actualized and that this is actualized by something else which is already actual. So, I mean, those are the sorts of things you would have to like really criticize to really tear down that argument.
Okay, and I think this is going to be like the main distinction. So the only way you could criticize these is through a metaphysical sense and no empirical way whatsoever.
I think that would be fair to say because the arguments are themselves metaphysical. I mean, it would just be a category error to attack the argument on one level where it's making claims on a totally different level.
I guess.
I mean,
I guess a little bit of. So if you had these, I guess like a logical, like I guess, for sake of argument, let's call it a presupposition. Even though we agree that it has to be in order for the, I guess, rules to work in the universe, is you would, I guess, from an empirical set of view, is you would look at these different metaphysical concepts as variables, and you would see how they interact with different logical axioms that you can more directly reserve, kind of like the Pythagorean example that we give. Even though it's not perfect, you can get close depending on the scenario. So I guess what you could do is that if you had a system that was a predictive model, like to basically predict how reality would happen, and if one of these variables included a metaphysical concept, I guess with low empirical certainty, you could, I guess, by proxy, find out how important this variable is to the equation, this metaphysical concept.
I guess one other thing to point out about these sorts of arguments, like the argument for motion, oftentimes they only need one instance of an actualization of a potential to reach the conclusion, or they require the concession that change is a real feature of the world in whatever sense that may take.
So you wouldn't say it wouldn't be a system of logical systems. It would just be one enacting onto something in order to have this characteristic.
Could you say that again?
I guess
I didn't quite catch that.
I guess to like explain something, I would imagine every single logical axiom would have to be enacting onto it if it applied.
Yeah, I guess I don't really grasp what you're getting at.
I guess a little bit of, like you're saying, in order to observe something, that we have to basically assume that causalities exist, and basically truth or objective things don't change over time, and that's being enacted on to the empirical realm, right? These logical axioms, right?
I would say that when we interpret certain experiences and interpret certain physical theories, no matter what those look like, we have to bring to the table some philosophy of nature already. Like we have to have some prior conception of what change is, and a bunch of other things too. Again, what a lot of physics even is being brought to the table even before you start doing any sort of interpretation. And any sort of interpretation is going to presuppose these, I think. So I guess that's kind of why I say that.
And I guess what I was trying to say a little bit. So those, basically the metaphysical argument of, I guess, the presuppositions that you have to make in order for things to even make logical sense. Each of those assumptions enact upon the empirical realm at once under the thing. Or like they all have to be, like you can't just have the law of identity and then not have another logical concept that doesn't have to apply to the scenario. Like I'm guessing they would all have to be applied under the empirical realm.
I think so. I mean, one of the goals at this level of analysis is to get those concepts down in like a system of like a philosophy of nature or metaphysics, just so you have an understanding of what those concepts that you're bringing to the table mean.
And I guess ultimately a little bit, I know it sounds a little odd, but what you could do, if it would be possible, is you would develop a system that has both laws developed through empirical, I guess, observation that would be close to the rational realm of arriving at conclusions, and you would have purely metaphysical, I guess, presuppositions that you would have to have in order for logic to work, incorporated within the model, or I guess an equation, to make it a bit easier. And then I guess ultimately you would try to test these different metaphysical presuppositions under different scenarios to view its outcome and see if its predictive capability changes at all if you alter certain assumptions about the metaphysical concept.
I mean, I guess, like I was saying earlier, that the goal at this level of analysis isn't predictive power like this, like we're engineers or something. Like if you can do some sort of analysis where you show like there's a conceptual contradiction in your philosophy of nature or in your metaphysics, you don't really need any further empirical tests to say that that's false. It's in the same way. Like in the same way,
get it by. I'm sorry, I'll continue. I guess a little bit, because we're talking about metaphysical things. There's no direct way to observe them empirically. So I guess kind of by proxy, what you would do, you would incorporate certain metaphysical models within an empirical model and see if that alters the predictive capability of it. And you would choose differing, like you could even make up logical presuppositions that wouldn't make sense and see if it would still alter the predictive capability. Because ultimately the metaphysical effects are the fundamentals of the empirical reality that we live in. So, I mean, I would just imagine just by that nature, if it affects empirical nature, then, and since empirical nature is observable, then you could observe how, if you model it correctly, how these metaphysical things affect the empirical.
I guess, again, the analysis doesn't seem to be appropriate to the thing that we desire to know. I mean, I guess the fundamental problem here is I don't accept this mode of verifying things through predictive power.
Oh, it won't verify it ever. It'll just it would basically test the model of it to see if it incorporates itself in the model or not. It would never reach an ultimate kind of like rationality version of truth or proofs, essentially. It would basically, because you have to view it in more in the empirical realm, it would have to test things in more of a empirical sense, even though it's a rational statement.
Yeah, I guess I just don't buy the assumption here that the way to come to knowledge on these matters like philosophy of nature and metaphysics is this sort of empirical test. I mean, like I was saying, I don't even think properly feasible, just because you have to bring some sort of, you have to bring these assumptions to the table when you start doing physics, for example. I mean, the analysis, it's going on at a totally different level than this this empirical sort of verification here. I mean, I come back to the point that the mode of verifying or coming to knowledge of whether it's true or not is just inappropriate, I think.
Because I know it sounds kind of odd, but it would be kind of trying to test a system of false logic. Like if you made presuppositions that were inherently false, like I said, 1 = 2.
Yeah.
And then you would basically try to build a logical system out of these false systems and see how it would behave. And then I guess ultimately what you would do, because metaphysics is trying to understand fundamental properties of reality, is you would compare false systems to true systems and their predictive capability.
I guess. I mean, it wouldn't really be. I mean, the way to show an error in that metaphysical system, I don't think, again, it's not predictive power. It's just to notice a contradiction right there, that 1 = 2. I mean, I don't think you have to proceed any further than that. I mean, I guess I just don't buy the whole mode of empirical verification that you're proposing here.
Well, I think I'm mostly proposing it because if you're gonna, I guess, try to argue with atheists, and I guess for vice versa of atheists, or trying to argue with theists, is this is how you're gonna try to convince them, is you can, like, even if you're correct and you have all the rational metaphysical claims you have and you say it's true, and let's say it is true, that won't convince basically any atheist that is heavily reliant upon empirical observation, as that is a more, and I guess, integral factor of changing their mind.
That might be right, but the way I would deal with that is not to adjust the arguments themselves. I would go after their naive empiricism. I think they have to. I think as a general standard, you should accept when something is proved, and you think the deduction is both valid and sound. I think you are bound to the conclusion. I mean, it doesn't really matter so much whether you can conjure up mental images of every single thing going on in the premises. Because usually, we can't do that. I mean, our intellects are very limited. I mean, but I think as a matter of rational principle, I think one of these logical arguments.
I guess like another way would be, because empiricism is kind of I would say can be used definitely as a form of pragmatism. Like it's very obvious how it models the real world and how it acts. Because I think what many people would have issues with, mostly like the pure rationalism, like you can develop systems to predict the volume of 4-dimensional cube, but that doesn't really have too much practicality in the world that we live in today. So they would probably argue that you could still derive these logical systems that are true. However, that does not mean that it applies to our world.
Yeah, I mean, truths like that are, I think, a problem for the empiricist.
Why would you say it's a problem for the empiricist?
Because it seems like we have knowledge about things like, I think the example you're talking about, like a tesseract or something. I mean, we seem to have knowledge about these things, and what is the empiricist saying, that they're not, it's knowledge about something that isn't the world, or is he perhaps he's denying that it's knowledge?
Well, I think it's because we don't live in a 4-dimensional space region where we have tesseracts and other 4-dimensional objects that we interact with. So they would argue that you can derive, logical statements that have, truth to them. However, it does not apply to this world.
I mean, as opposed to what?
I guess in a purely pragmatic sense, like basically it'd be kind of like to bring up some, stereotypes of how a physicist and how a mathematician would approach a problem. Is that, like, if you had before special relativity, they say, oh, I just don't care about all that extra dimensional crap, just give me the 3D stuff and I'm good. And then until special relativity came around, they said, oh, can you show me how things interact if it has another spatial dimension added to it?
Yeah.
It'd be kind of things like that, but you could also abstract, like you can find out how things interact if there's 5 dimensions or 6 or 7 or so on and so forth. But you could argue that, that doesn't mean we live in a world that has 289 dimensions. And so they would ultimately say that, so these logical statements are true, and how it predicts how 289 dimensional space would work. That does not mean that it's applies to our world empirically, like how we observe things. That would not apply to how things work.
I mean, I guess I wouldn't say that it doesn't apply to the world. I would just say that it doesn't apply to the realm of like things that are made of matter. But it's a truth about ideas, that the way abstract objects are relating to one another.
Yeah, I think
that's a conclusion I draw from that, and because I draw that conclusion, I draw the additional conclusion that this naive empiricism can't quite be right.
I think that's it could just be the ignorance on my part on how these terms work. So I guess when I said our world, I guess I meant the kind of the realm of matter and such. So I guess ultimately, like, so if you're probably going to deal with atheists, you're going to be, and if you're going to, I'm not sure if you could convince them of any of these arguments, because it wouldn't essentially deal with the world of matter and how to test things within it. Even though they could agree that there are logical systems, that doesn't, I guess, necessitate that it applies to the realm of matter. And I think that's what they would argue.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I accept that, because the premises within the argument for motion, or Phaser's what he calls the Aristotelian argument, like what I was talking about there, about the decomposing the T into concurrent actualizations of potentials of more fundamental layers of reality like that. I mean, those are starting from as examples from experience, aren't they? I mean, this isn't some like wild abstraction that I'm starting from. I mean, there are some arguments which start from wild abstractions, but I mean, these ones aren't.
Yeah, from your video, I would say most of these assumptions are based on, I guess, day-to-day experiences that you observe.
I mean, I would just say it's reasoning from those day-to-day experiences and drawing out the implications.
And I guess ultimately,
that's all
I'm gonna play the part of a fedora tipper. I'm gonna say, what's your evidence for that?
Well, where's my evidence for things changing?
Sure, like where's the empirical data, and that it must always change.
Well, if he denies that, then that is a change in and of itself in his own mental state. Like,
you would say there's some other issues other than disagreement going on there.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think the premises of, like, for example, the argument for motion or the Aristotelian proof in Fraser's book, I don't think these can be coherently denied, to be honest. But I mean, people will disagree. I mean, like, especially the reality of change, though, because there have to be at least certain changes, like in your own mental states within your own conscious experience. Like you can go from believing that change is a real feature of the world to believing that change is not a real feature of the world.
Yeah, I think people can change their minds for sure. And
I mean,
I guess
even that's a change of a sort, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, that's one. I mean, this goes back to like the classic like Parmenides paradoxes about the possibility of change. But I mean, that's a whole separate discussion.
And I guess
I was going to say, perhaps, because I think we've been going on for 3 hours here.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I didn't even notice.
Lost track of the time here. Yeah, I mean, I enjoy talking about this stuff, so it's no problem.
You may need to change the title. I'm not too sure how much we focused on the, nature of God too much throughout this discussion.
Yeah, that's all right.
You probably just have to change it to a discussion about
stuff like general epistemology and
it seems that's what
logic.
We focused on mostly.
Yeah. I guess I didn't really have any major questions for you.
I would imagine you would have questions because I guess you were an atheist before, so you kind of knew your own mindset. But I guess but probably an important thing to keep in mind is many people aren't like you, so they won't be convinced by the same things you are.
Oh, of course. I mean, yeah, different things convince different people. I mean, like you said, you were saying before, like the psychology of belief is extremely complex.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess
people,
because you said one of the I noticed for a bunch of it's just a trend that I've seen between many, I guess atheist turned theist or. I've noticed that many of them were questioning the nature of morality in a sense. And I was basically wondering, because you also watch, I guess, Friended Forever and, his obsession with Jonathan Haidt and his moral foundations theory. I guess, would you find that as an acceptable model to, I guess, explain human morality and how it developed within humans?
Yeah, I've got to get around to reading his book. Was it The Righteous Mind?
Yeah. He does have a little bit of philosophy, but it barely goes over it.
Yeah, see, like I said, I'll have to read the book, but from what I've gathered, it doesn't seem that Haidt is doing like meta ethics or anything like that. He's not like saying what ethics is.
Not whatsoever.
Right. It seems like what he's doing is more along the lines of moral psychology, like how we reason about morality, not like what ethics as such is.
Yeah, it's a very evolutionary psychological perspective. Like it's not a saying like this is what right's and wrong. It's just saying this is how we came to be of what we perceive as right and wrong.
Yeah, I mean that could very well be true.
And you would say that would that be independent from, I guess, the realm of abstract of what's actually right and what's actually wrong?
Well, I guess I would say that those are two separate questions, like saying what ethics even is on the one hand, and on the other hand, how we reason about ethics, how we reach conclusions.
And I guess to say, like, if you have this, like with Jonathan Haidt with the moral foundations theory, if it has this predictive model to some degree explain moral behaviors within groups of people, would you say would that have to counter in to how we view ethics from, I guess, an evolutionary psychological perspective? On, I guess, a little bit.
I guess you're asking if the model seems
Like
pretty
could
good.
Like if if the model's good enough, could it, and what it thinks and what it predicts how humans behave within moral systems, could it essentially, if you could extrapolate it far enough, and I don't think you could, because I'm one of those bounded models people, and I don't think you can explain everything with it, is could you explain then ethics using basically a system of just saying we're a bunch of great apes that form moral communities to basically propagate our genes?
Well, I mean, there are multiple levels to that analysis. First of all, like what we are, like doing philosophical anthropology, like answer your question, what is man? Which is properly what I guess what psychology is. Like if you decompose the word, like psyche and logos, I mean the study of the soul. I mean, like trying to answer the question of what man is, that would be distinct from the question of this propagation of genes stuff, and that would be separate from. Well, I mean, the study of the soul would also lead into the question of like what our natural ends are, and that would also lead into what ethics is, I think. But I'm not sure if Haidt is trying to answer those sorts of questions. I think he's just trying to do.
Trying to answer. He's just building a
reasoning,
like model. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it seems pretty interesting though, because if I remember correctly, he has his like by analogy says that we reason in the moral sphere like we taste, like we have certain taste buds, and in the moral sphere there are certain moral taste buds. There's like
6 moral foundations.
Purity. Yeah, those are called the moral foundations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I forget what they are. I remember one was like purity. That's the only one I remember.
Yeah.
Was honor one of them?
I don't think honor is probably authority or subversion. That's one of the categories. That's probably the one you're thinking of. It's basically subversion. The one that established hierarchical behaviors within great primates.
Absolutely subversive.
Oh, it's
yeah.
Basically a respect for hierarchy is what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to get around to reading that book. I mean, it seems very interesting though, because I mean, I think it kind of lends support to a moral realism view that there are actually moral facts that we can reason toward, and we tend to reason about them in very similar ways, as opposed to say like a moral relativist or something like that, or like a cultural relativist.
Well, I guess it would. I guess how it would view to an objective morality, if it could, it would be more of a sense of humans have like it wouldn't view morality as this objective abstract sense. It would view it more of a thing that developed within human minds in order to help propagate the genes within large groups better.
I guess
view morality more in that sense. So
yeah, I mean,
it would basically the morality would be depending on how you view it, and you would get radically different conclusions. Like it would be essentially a society that would, adhere group cohesion to further their propagative genes and the characteristics of these moral attributes into society to, in order for the society to be successful. Like it's not a moral sense at all. Like I would say ultimately, if you drove this out to its final conclusion, if you viewed morality in this sense, just as the propagation of genes, you would just basically have then just one society, like you would genocide the rest, and you would just basically then make a bunch of baby factories to propagate those genes as much as possible.
Yeah,
but
I mean,
I think we agree that's not a moral thing to do, but I guess in an evolutionary term, that would be a moral system would arrive that naturally if it was down to natural selection.
Yeah, I mean, that's, certainly I don't buy the conclusion that our final ends as human beings are the propagation of genes. I mean, that's kind of an inference that's being drawn from other fields. It's not really clear where that comes from specifically. Is that Dawkins' view?
Dawkins is funny enough.
The
It's
selfish gene.
Part of Haidt's book actually disagrees a ton with the selfish gene, and he goes into because one of the large arguments for one of the assumptions you have to make for moral foundations theory, and it's not really an assumption because there is data to back it up, is you have basically genes that propagate through social behavior. Like an example would be if you have farmers have chickens and hens, and so they choose the hens that lay the most eggs. However, this often doesn't work because those hens are often the most aggressive and end up killing and eating each other.
Yeah.
So what they do is that they look at a group of like about a dozen hens and see the result of which of those groups lay the most eggs. And so that'd be an example of you would have essentially traits that would help propagate the species, but these traits are established in more of a group. So these various alleles wouldn't just be present in a single individual, but more of a series of alleles that would propagate through different individuals in order to form a group. And then essentially these series of alleles kind of propagate together within the next group to adhere group cohesion and compatibility.
Yeah, I mean, these are interesting ideas. I mean, I guess I would have to read the book to have an accurate judgment on them. I mean, a lot of the times the assumptions going into them, they don't really have any import for me because they assume things like our natural lens are the propagation of genes. I mean, so whatever conclusions you draw from that, I mean, it doesn't really have any import for me because I don't buy the assumption to begin with. But
to probably tie it back, because also with moral foundations theory, it doesn't make a declarative statement of the validity of religion, but it shows how religion is useful in the sense of building into institutions to better basically adhere group cohesion. Like you have this moral psychology to basically form groups, and the moral foundations theory basically says religion is a really good way to form groups within different societies. And so, a good way to test, I guess, because an example would be like Christianity works pretty well with the West, even though probably a lot of people are going to disagree. But like, you don't have a overabundance of basically the Middle Eastern interpretation of Islam in the Western world, because that institution does not mix well with Western institutions. But various forms of Christianity does mix well with Western institutions. So it allows these religions to thrive in these environments.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I agree with the punchlines of all those. I guess I would phrase it slightly differently. I mean, I certainly accept that religion is a natural product from what we are, and it just flows from what we are as human beings, that we are in our nature religious. that it's natural for humans to be religious. I mean, there's no contention on that issue on my part. I mean, I would phrase it slightly differently. Like, I think you can learn that religion is natural for the human soul just by reading, say, St. Augustine. I mean, I think we've known this for quite some time, or even Aristotle.
Well, I think even atheists would probably agree. Like, I don't know if they would say it's a natural affinity towards religion, probably just more of a natural affinity towards, I guess, tribal behavior, is that you're going to form groups around certain values.
I mean, I guess, even though I guess you were saying before that one of the benefits, I mean, I hate talking pragmatically like this, but one of the benefits is that it unites people too. I mean, I don't think, for example, Christianity is as tribal as like the those who are fetched by evolutionary psychology think it is.
Well, I don't think they.
I mean, it seems to be.
They
It seems
do
to be a
view
great
it as
unifying.
changing. Like, basically, you know history probably a lot better than I do, but there has been a lot of reformations within just Christianity itself and how it's changed over time, correct?
Yeah, that's certainly
And
true.
I guess people would, yeah. So I would imagine with moral foundations theory, you would argue that these changes necessitated in order to better suit basically the civilization that it had. Because like currently, you don't need to stop the gays from getting married if there's not too much, I guess, worry for, I guess, sexual instability. I mean, I guess people would worry because there is a lot of, young adults being pregnant at an alarming rate in certain areas of the United States.
Mhm.
So I guess that would be
Yeah, I mean,
basically,
I guess I would say that a lot of these factors aren't expressions of tribalistic forces. I mean, they seem to be expressions of the way certain doctrines play themselves out, and also the way certain societal changes affect for better or worse, people's actions. I mean, I guess I don't read these as like tribalistic expressions.
I don't know if tribalistic is probably the best word. It's probably more of a group cohesion behavior. I guess it would be characteristics that would encourage a groupish behavior to incur. And I guess what I mean, like we both agreed that Christianity has changed throughout the years, and many would argue that it's basically adapted to fit the civilization that it occupied currently. And through this adaptation, it was able to propagate and basically become a larger cohesive group within society.
Yeah, I mean, like on the topic of Christianity, that's a whole separate discussion. Like, what exactly we mean, like when I say that Christianity's changed, like I mean, I guess I wouldn't phrase it like that. That the truth of Christianity has changed at all. Perhaps we can say that. I mean, I know it in the sense that you mean it, like
I would say
the Protestant
interpretations
Reformation
of
happened.
the text.
Right. Yeah, like the Protestant Reformation happened, and their splinterings of the Protestant factions. Like certainly that has come
Like,
about.
I mean,
I mean,
guess does
I mean,
anyone?
I guess we'll have to bracket that discussion because that's. I mean, Christianity is extremely
Yeah,
complex.
and yeah, I guess it's been a while. I didn't mean to
Yeah. So
drag you on this long.
no, that's fine. I mean, I thought this was a pretty interesting conversation. Yeah, I guess I'll have to adjust the title of the stream, but yeah, I think this is fun. So if you had some, we'll have to think of another topic so we could get together again sometime.
Yeah, I'll try to think of something maybe.
Sure.
I'm new to this
And
YouTube thing. It's my first live
yeah,
stream.
I mean, it's yeah,
So
I mean,
I'm not-
this stuff is easy. Live stream stuff. I mean, this is way easier than like making a video. I mean, like making videos requires effort. I mean, I've got to actually think about things.
Yeah, I made a video
Present a
before.
case.
It was garbage. I privated it pretty much immediately.
Well, I mean, I think most of my videos when I go watch them like a couple months later are just garbage anyway. But whatever. But yeah, I mean, like I said, we'll have to have another conversation sometime. And if,
Yeah, I
if
guess-
anyone's watching too, perhaps we can, if you want to join in on the conversation sometime. Like I was saying, like I've been kind of disappointed in like the quality of conversation on this topic in the,
Yeah, I
the
guess-
YouTube sphere.
I think if we do it again next time for sure, it would probably be better if with a couple people, but not too many. Was I think just with you and me is that we just kind of free flowed from one topic to the next without having to focus on the main discussion too much.
Yeah, we need like an authority figure here.
Yeah,
Keep us on
someone
track.
slap us around a bit.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining me, and thank you for those people who've stuck around. This was 3 hours and 15 minutes.
I don't know why they would.
I don't know.
Who were the 18 people that liked it?
I don't know. All right. Well, have a good night, and thank you to Gwen for joining me.